The soldier on the gurney had no pulse, no brain activity, and no name. The doctors had already moved on, but Nurse Mara Voss hadn't. While the trauma team argued over paperwork and the chief surgeon made jokes at her expense, Mara stood over that body and noticed something nobody else bothered to look for. A puncture mark behind the left ear, clean as a needle, precise as an execution. Her hands weren't shaking, her face showed nothing, but her mind was already running calculations she hadn't used in 6 years. Calculations that had nothing to do with nursing, and everything to do with what she used to be. If this story has you hooked already, follow my channel and stay until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go. Renner Valley General Hospital sat at the edge of a city that had been declining slowly for a decade. The kind of place where budget cuts showed up in the ceiling tiles and the vending machines, where the parking lot lights had been out since February and nobody filed a work order because nobody expected anything to change. It was Tuesday morning, just past 6, and the overnight staff was running on cold coffee and the specific exhaustion that sets in around hour 11 of a 12-hour shift. Mara Voss moved through the ER like she always did, efficiently, quietly, taking up as little space as possible. She was 34, medium height, with close-cropped brown hair and the kind of face that didn't invite conversation. She wasn't unfriendly, she was just contained. She'd learned to be. 3 years at Renner Valley, and she'd figured out exactly how much visibility was safe, how much to offer, and how much to hold back. She kept her head down, did her work, and went home to her apartment where she had 3 houseplants and a stack of unread books, and nothing else that required anything from her. The ER charge nurse, a broad-shouldered man named Dennis Reyes, flagged her down near the supply closet. "Voss, Bay 3 needs a restock. Sutures, saline, the usual." "Already done it," she said. He blinked. "What? 20 minutes ago? I saw it was low." He looked at her like she'd said something in a foreign language, then nodded and moved on. This was how it always went. She anticipated problems and solved them before anyone noticed, and nobody ever said thank you because nobody really noticed she'd done anything in the first place. It had bothered her at first. Now it was just the texture of the job. She was checking vitals on a 60-year-old man with chest pain in Bay 6 when she heard Dr. Callum Hurst's voice carrying across the department. Hurst was the chief of emergency surgery, late 50s, silver-haired, with the particular arrogance of a man who had been told he was exceptional for so long that he'd stopped questioning it. He had a voice that projected even when he wasn't trying, and right now he was definitely trying. "Where's my imaging report on the bilateral fracture in Bay 1? A resident scrambled past Mara, nearly knocking into her. She pressed herself against the wall without thinking, an old habit, and the resident didn't even glance back. "Voss?" Hurst's voice landed on her like something dropped from a height. She turned. He was standing in the middle of the ER floor, arms crossed, looking at her with an expression she recognized. Not anger exactly, more like mild contempt, the kind a person reserves for things slightly beneath their attention. "Did you sign off on the discharge paperwork for the woman in Bay 9, the one with the ankle fracture?" "I did. She met all discharge criteria and her... I don't remember asking for your reasoning." He cut her off without raising his voice, which was somehow worse than if he had. "I asked if you did it. The answer is yes or no." The ER had gone a little quieter around them. Not silent. There was always noise in a trauma center, but the nearby staff had registered the exchange, the way people register weather. "Yes," Mara said, "without consulting me. You were in surgery. The attending on duty cleared it." Hurst's expression shifted into something almost theatrical. "The attending on duty," he repeated, like the phrase itself was absurd. He looked at the resident standing behind him, a young woman named Priya, who had the good sense to be studying her clipboard. "This is exactly the problem with this department. People who don't have the qualifications to make independent decisions keep making independent decisions." He looked back at Mara. "You're a floor nurse, Ms. Voss. You dispense medication and you hold hands. You don't make calls on my patients." The words landed the way he intended them to. Flat and clean, like a scalpel. Mara didn't move. She let the silence settle for exactly 2 seconds, then said, "The patient is fine, Dr. Hurst. That's not the point." "I know it isn't," she said, and turned back to her work. She heard him make a short, dismissive sound behind her. A few people nearby exchanged glances. Nobody said anything. Nobody ever did. Mara finished her vitals check on Bay 6, wrote her notes, and walked to the break room. She poured the last of the burned coffee into a paper cup and stood at the window looking out at the parking lot. The sky was overcast. A trash bag had blown against the chain-link fence near the ambulance bay, and nobody had picked it up. She drank the coffee without tasting it. She had been a different person in a different life. She didn't think about that life constantly. She'd gotten good at not thinking about it, but sometimes something small would trigger it, the way a certain kind of authority treated her, the particular tone Hurst had used. She'd heard that tone before, in places where the stakes were considerably higher than a discharge form. She threw away the cup and went back to work. The call came in at 7:43 a.m. Multiple traumas incoming, vehicle versus motorcycle, the dispatch said too critical. Mara was already at the bay doors when the first ambulance pulled in, and she registered the standard chaos of a bad accident, the paramedics shouting handoff information, the blood, the equipment, and slotted herself into the response team automatically. The second ambulance arrived 4 minutes later. This one was different. She felt it before she could name why. The paramedics were moving wrong, too careful, too deliberate for a trauma response. There were two of them, and they had the gurney out fast, but they weren't running. They were watching their surroundings. One of them, a stocky man with a shaved head, scanned the ER entrance before he pushed through the doors. That wasn't something paramedics did. That was something else entirely. The patient on the gurney was male, large, somewhere between 30 and 40. No ID, no wallet, no phone. He was dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, a plain gray Henley, but the clothes were wrong somehow, too deliberately ordinary, like a costume. His head was turned to the side, and he was deeply, completely unresponsive. No movement, no response to stimulation, pupils fixed and dilated. What do we have? Hurst was already there, snapping gloves on. John Doe, the stocky paramedic said. Found in a parking garage on Keene Street. No apparent external trauma. No documentation. How long unresponsive? Unknown. Minimum 40 minutes since we found him. Hurst leaned over the patient, ran a quick visual assessment, checked the pupils. His expression shifted into something businesslike and decisive. GCS of 3. Fixed pupils, no motor response, get me a head CT and I want neurology down here. Mara was on the other side of the gurney. She had gloves on and was running through her own assessment. Pulse, temperature, skin color, and her hands slowed over his wrist. His pulse was there. Barely, but there. She looked at the monitor as it was connected. Heart rate 22 beats per minute, the kind of number that appears on monitors in two situations. Equipment malfunction, or someone who should technically be dead but isn't. She looked at his skin. Color was off. Not the grayish blue of cardiac failure. Something different. Something with a slight yellowish undertone she'd seen in exactly one context and not in a hospital. She looked at his neck. She almost missed it. It was behind his left ear, partially obscured by the hairline. A puncture mark, small and precise, with the faint bruising of a very fine gauge needle. The skin around it was clean. Not an IV site. Not a trauma injury. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing had put something into this man with the kind of precision that took either professional training or very expensive equipment. She straightened up. She opened her mouth. Dr. Hurst, get me the contrast for CT, Hurst said to the room in general. Dr. Hurst, I need to show you something on this patient. He glanced at her with the expression he reserved for interruptions. Ms. Voss, the imaging, his skin tone is wrong for cerebral hemorrhage. His pulse is 22, but his skin is warm. There's a puncture mark behind his left ear, and it's not consistent with any of the paramedics' equipment. A short pause. Hurst looked at her, then at the patient, then back at her. You're describing a pharmacological scenario based on a skin impression and a mark the size of a pinhole. I'm describing what I see. What you see, he repeated, and the flatness in his voice was back. He looked at Priya. Get neurology and get CT. If this is chemical paralysis, the CT won't show anything, Mara said. Ms. Voss. He said her name like a door closing. I understand you have opinions. I understand you like to share them. but we're going to follow protocol, which you are not in a position to deviate from, and you're going to let the people with the appropriate training make the clinical decisions. Is that understood?" The ER around them had gone quiet again, same as before. Everyone watching the same way they'd watched earlier, and nobody saying a word. "Understood," Mara said, but she didn't move away from the gurney. The CT came back 40 minutes later showing no hemorrhage, no mass, no structural abnormality of any kind. Neurology came down. A tall man named Dr. Fenwick, who smelled like coffee and spoke in slow, measured sentences, reviewed the scans, performed his own assessment, and delivered his conclusion with the particular gravity of someone announcing a verdict. "No neurological basis for recovery," he said. "Glasgow Coma Scale consistent with brain death. I'd recommend beginning the protocol. Brain death protocol. Organ donation evaluation. The machinery that kicks in when medicine has decided there's nothing left to save." Hurst nodded. "I agree. Let's start the documentation." Mara was at the medication station 12 feet away, preparing another patient's medications. Her hands were moving through the task automatically, while her mind was somewhere else entirely. She was thinking about a compound she hadn't thought about in 6 years. A synthetic agent, developed in the late 2000s, used in classified contexts for exactly the kind of presentation this man was showing. Complete peripheral motor paralysis, suppressed autonomic function, preserved core viability. A shutdown, not a death. Reversible, if you caught it fast enough and knew what to reverse it with. She was thinking about who would have access to that compound, and why a man with military tattoos and civilian clothes would show up in a parking garage in Renner Valley with no documentation and that specific puncture mark behind his ear. She was thinking about what the tattoos meant. She'd cataloged them in the first 30 seconds. Upper arm, left side of chest, the inside of the right wrist. The designs weren't decorative, they were markers. The kind that a certain type of unit used before the practice was officially discontinued. She knew exactly what they marked because she'd operated alongside people who wore them. She set down the medication tray. She walked back to Bay 4, where the John Doe was now on a ventilator, monitors running, a nurse checking his lines. "Can you give me a minute?" Mara said. The nurse, a young man named Trevor who'd been at Renner Valley for about 4 months, looked uncertain. "He's Dr. Hurst's patient." "I know. I just need to check something on his IV line. 1 minute." Trevor shrugged and stepped out. Mara stood at the bedside. The monitors beeped steadily. The ventilator pushed air in and out with mechanical patience. She leaned down close to the man's hand, which was lying palm up on the sheet. She pressed 2 fingers against the inside of his wrist, not checking his pulse, positioning her fingers precisely against a specific point of nerve tissue. Then she tapped. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Pause. 1 tap. She waited. For 8 seconds, nothing happened. Then the man's index finger moved. Not a reflex. Not a random motor twitch. It pressed down twice against the sheet. Deliberate. Intentional. An answer. Mara straightened up. She exhaled very slowly through her nose. He was in there. Fully conscious, fully aware, completely locked inside a body that had been chemically shut down. He could hear everything that had been said about him. He had heard the brain death discussion. He had heard the organ donation protocol being initiated. She had maybe 2 hours before the documentation process moved forward. She pulled out her personal phone, against hospital policy, and opened a notes application. She typed fast, using a notation system she hadn't used since she'd left, then stopped herself. She couldn't do this the way she was thinking about doing it. Not here, not with what she had access to, not without authorization. But the alternative was letting them harvest organs from a man who was awake. She put the phone away and went to find the drug reference she needed. The medication cabinet in the back supply room was locked with a keypad Mara had memorized 6 months ago when the charge nurse gave her the code for a legitimate emergency and she'd filed it away without meaning to. She keyed it in now and scanned the shelves with her phone flashlight, reading labels fast. She wasn't looking for the reversal agent. They wouldn't have that. It didn't officially exist in any civilian formulary. She was looking for something that would buy time, a combination that would partially restore autonomic function, enough to make the monitors show activity that couldn't be explained away as artifact, enough to force a reassessment before the protocol moved forward. It was not approved. It was not in any guideline. It was the kind of thing that got nurses fired and licenses revoked and, in the wrong circumstances, got people brought up on charges. She found what she needed. She drew it up into a syringe. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. She'd noticed that about herself a long time ago, that when things got bad enough, something in her went very quiet and very still, like a different part of her brain took over. She'd been told it was useful. She'd also been told it was unsettling. Both were probably true. She walked back to Bay 4. Trevor was back at the nurse's station. Hurst was somewhere in the department. She had maybe 4 minutes before anyone looked this direction. She connected the syringe to the IV line, ran the math one more time in her head, and pushed the plunger. Then she stood back and watched the monitor. 30 seconds, 45, a full minute. The numbers on the screen didn't change. She pressed her lips together. She'd gotten the dosage right. She was almost certain she'd gotten the dosage right. But there was a variable she couldn't account for, which was exactly what agent had been used and in what concentration. If she was wrong about the compound, she'd given this man a drug cocktail that would do nothing. If she was very wrong, she'd made things worse. 90 seconds. The heart rate monitor ticked upward. 22, 27, 31. On the screen, the flat line of the EEG began to show the faintest irregular texture. Not nothing. Not normal. Something. The man's hand moved. Not the finger this time. The whole hand turning slightly, palm rotating toward the ceiling. Then his chest expanded. Not the ventilator's rhythm. His rhythm. His lungs pushing air in a voluntary breath that stuttered against the machine's cycle. The monitor alarmed. Mara silenced it before the sound carried, which bought her about 30 seconds before the automatic alert reached the nurse's station. Hey. She leaned close to his ear. She kept her voice very low. I know you're in there. I know what was done to you. You're at Renner Valley General. I'm a nurse here. My name is Mara. She paused. If you can hear me, press your thumb against your palm. His thumb moved. Okay, she said. Okay, I'm going to get you out of this. But I need you to hold on a little longer. The bay curtain yanked back. Hurst stood there. Behind him, Trevor, looking uncomfortable. And behind Trevor, a woman Mara didn't recognize. Administrative staff, from the badge, someone from the 4th floor. Hurst looked at the monitor. He looked at the hand that had moved. He looked at Mara. What? He said slowly. Did you do? It wasn't a question. She could see him working through it. The changed readings, the unauthorized absence, the syringe she hadn't had time to dispose of, still in her jacket pocket. I administered a medication protocol, she said. He stopped. He started again. You administered an unauthorized drug combination to a brain-dead patient without my knowledge or consent. He's not brain-dead. The neurologist, got it wrong. She said it without heat, without apology. His presentation is consistent with a classified synthetic paralytic agent. The CT was negative because it's pharmacological, not structural. He is conscious, he is responsive to stimuli, and if you proceed with the organ donation protocol, you will be killing a man who is awake. The silence in the bay was absolute. Hurst's jaw tightened. He looked at the monitors again, at the readings that shouldn't be there if his diagnosis was correct. He looked at the patient's hand, which had moved again, fingers curling slowly, deliberately. Get security, Hurst said to Trevor. He said it quietly, which was worse than if he'd shouted. Dr. Hurst, you are done in this department, he said to Mara. You are done in this hospital. I'm going to make sure you never work in a clinical setting again for as long as you live. 2 security guards appeared at the curtain. They were young, both of them, and they looked uncertain. Escort her out, Hurst said. One of the guards reached for Mara's arm. She didn't resist. There was no point in resisting. Not here, not this way. She let them lead her toward the bay exit, walking between them with her hands loose at her sides. At the curtain, she stopped and turned back. The man on the bed, the man nobody had a name for, had turned his head. Not much. A few degrees. But enough to find her and enough that she could see his eyes, which were open now, which were fully open and fully aware, and fixed on her with an expression that had nothing to do with confusion or fear. It was recognition. He knew what she was. He'd known from the first taps against his wrist. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then security walked her out into the hallway, and the bay curtain fell closed behind her, and somewhere in the building, Dr. Hurst was already making phone calls that would end her career before noon. But they walked her to the locker room and told her to collect her things. One of the guards stood in the doorway. She took her jacket, her bag, her phone charger. She didn't have much. She'd learned not to accumulate things in spaces she might have to leave. She was sitting on the bench pulling on her shoes when her personal phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost ignored it. She answered. Static. Then a voice. Male, clipped, professional. This is a courtesy contact. Do not acknowledge this call verbally. If you are at Renner Valley General and you have a John Doe in Bay 4, proceed to the hospital's east loading dock in the next 11 minutes. Do not bring your hospital credentials. The line went dead. She sat with the phone in her hand for about 4 seconds. Then she tied her second shoe and stood up. The guard at the door said, I need to walk you out through the main. I know the way, she said, and walked past him. He followed, which she'd expected. She moved through the corridor, turned left at the junction toward the main exit, and then, when a supply cart created a momentary obstruction between her and the guard, turned right instead, through a stairwell door, down one level, and out through a maintenance corridor she'd memorized during her 3rd week at Renner Valley because she'd always liked knowing her exits. The east loading dock was at the back of the building, separated from the main ambulance bay by a concrete wall. She pushed through the heavy door and stepped into gray morning air. There were 3 vehicles parked at the dock. 2 were hospital supply trucks. The 3rd was a black SUV with government plates and tinted windows that had no reason to be there. The passenger door opened. A man got out. He was somewhere in his 40s, dressed in civilian clothes that fit the same way Hearst's scrubs fit him, like a uniform he'd put on over something else. He had a military bearing so deeply embedded it showed up in how he stood, how he scanned the dock, how he held his hands. He looked at her for a moment. Mara Voss, he said. Not a question. Yes. You administered an experimental reversal protocol to a DoD asset approximately 22 minutes ago. I don't know what you're talking about, she said automatically. The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile. No, of course not. Let me rephrase. You saved his life. We've been tracking his location for 19 hours. We didn't know if he was alive until your intervention triggered a biometric response in his monitoring implant. He paused. We have 11 minutes before the doctor inside makes a very serious mistake. Can you walk us through the extraction? Mara looked at the SUV, at the man in front of her, at the gray sky above the loading dock where a helicopter would have plenty of room to set down if it needed to. She thought about the man on the bed whose eyes had found hers, the recognition in them, the absolute stillness of someone trained to endure. Who is he? She asked. The man in civilian clothes looked at her steadily. Someone we need back, he said, and you're the only person in that building who figured out he was still there to get. From somewhere above the hospital, distant at first, then rapidly closer, came the percussive thudding of rotor blades cutting through morning air. Mara turned to look up. 2 black shapes dropped out of the overcast sky and swung toward the building, fast and low, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not fear, not quite. Something older than that. Something she'd buried under 3 years of quiet hallways and supply restocks and a chief surgeon's contempt. Walk me through what you need, she said, and she went back inside. The man's name was Rourke. He didn't offer a last name, and Mara didn't ask for one. That was its own kind of language, and she was still fluent. He walked beside her through the maintenance corridor at a pace that was fast without looking rushed, which was a skill, and he talked while he walked, feeding her information in the compressed, priority-ordered way that people with operational backgrounds used when time was the constraint. His name is Sergeant First Class Damon Reyes, Rourke said. Special Missions Unit, attached to a task force that doesn't appear on any public record. He was inserted into Renner Valley 48 hours ago for a meet that went sideways. We lost his signal at 0300 this morning. The parking garage on Keene Street is 2 blocks from the target location. What was the meet? Above your clearance level. She didn't push. The compound, do you know which variant? A beat. We think it's a derivative of VX7, modified for slower metabolic breakdown. She processed that. VX7 derivative meant the partial reversal she'd initiated would hold for roughly 90 minutes before his system began resuppressing. After that, without the full antidote, he'd slide back toward the shutdown state. The difference this time was that his body would fight it, which sounded better than it was, because a body fighting a synthetic paralytic at that level generated a kind of internal stress that could cause cardiac arrhythmia, pulmonary edema, or worse. "You have the full antidote?" she asked. "It's on the second bird." "How long to get it into him?" "That depends on how fast we can get to him." They came out of the maintenance corridor into a service hallway that ran parallel to the ER's back wall. Mara knew this hallway. She'd walked it 100 times on restocking runs. 40 feet ahead, a door on the right opened into the supply staging area adjacent to Bay 4. She slowed. "Problem," she said. Rourke looked at her. "Hurst will have security positioned at the bay, possibly more than the two who walked me out. He'll want to make sure I don't come back. And if he's initiated the brain death protocol, there may already be a transplant coordinator involved, which means additional personnel with their own institutional agenda." "How many entry points to the bay?" "Curtained front, service door from the staging area. The service door has a push-bar latch. No keypad, no lock." "Can we get him on a gurney and moving before anyone reacts?" "Not without someone running interference on Hurst." Rourke touched his earpiece, said nothing out loud, just pressed 2 fingers against it for a second. He was communicating with someone she couldn't hear, and she let him do it. She was running her own calculations. The bay layout, the staff currently on shift, who would and wouldn't follow Hurst's instructions without question. "We have 2 minutes before the second team makes entry through the main ER," he said. "When that happens, focus shifts to the front. That's our window." "Your team is coming through the front of a hospital, with documentation that will make it look like a federal patient transfer. And if Hurst doesn't recognize the documentation," Rourke looked at her, "he doesn't have to recognize it. He just has to hesitate long enough." She thought about Hurst, his certainty, his absolute confidence in his own authority in any room he occupied. He would hesitate, not because he doubted himself, but because the documentation would represent something outside his hierarchy, and men like Hurst needed exactly 2 seconds to recalibrate when they encountered a hierarchy above their own. 2 seconds was enough. "Okay," she said. "Here's what happens." What happened was not smooth. She'd want to be clear about that later, in her own mind, because there was a version of this story where everything clicked into place and moved like a machine, and that version wasn't true. What actually happened was that she pushed through the service door into the staging area and nearly walked directly into Trevor, who was restocking a cart, and turned around with an expression of complete surprise when he saw her. "Mara, you're not supposed to be—" "Trevor," she kept her voice level, "I need you to go take your break right now." "What?" "Go, take your break. Go to the break room, pour yourself some coffee, and stay there for 15 minutes. He stared at her. He was 26 years old, and he'd been a nurse for 8 months, and he didn't have nearly enough experience to know what to do with what was happening. She could see him working through it, the competing imperatives, the fact that she'd been fired, the fact that she was asking him to do something that felt wrong, but that he couldn't entirely articulate why. "Is this about the John Doe?" he asked. "Trevor, because the transplant coordinator is already here, Mara, and if there's something, if he's not actually—" "Go take your break," she said. "I mean it. Don't be in this hallway." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he set down the supplies he was holding and walked out through the far door without looking back. She didn't know if that was courage or self-preservation, and it didn't matter. He was gone. She pushed through into Bay 4. Hurst was there. He'd changed to a fresh pair of gloves, and there was a woman beside him in a lanyard and business casual clothes. The transplant coordinator, exactly as she'd predicted. One of the security guards from earlier stood at the curtained entrance. The monitor was still running, still showing the elevated readings her intervention had produced. Hurst looked up. The expression on his face moved through surprise, then anger, then something colder. "I will have you arrested," he said. "Look at his vitals," Mara said. "I don't need to—" "Look at them." Hurst's jaw worked. He looked at the monitor. The heart rate was sitting at 38. Not normal, but nothing like the 22 he'd recorded earlier. The EEG still showed that irregular, insistent texture that didn't belong in a brain-dead patient. "That's artifact," he said, "from whatever you gave him. His respiratory drive responded to stimuli 12 minutes ago. He's initiating voluntary breaths against the vent. That's not artifact, Dr. Hurst. That's a patient. You are not a physician. You are not in a position to... I'm not asking you to take my word for it. She moved to the bedside and pressed 2 fingers against Reyes's wrist in the same position as before. She tapped. The sequence. She waited. His thumb pressed into his palm. Once. Twice. The transplant coordinator made a sound. Hurst stared at the hand. That's motor artifact. Ask him to do it again, Mara said. She looked at Hurst directly. You ask him. You tell him to move his thumb if he can hear you, and you watch what happens. A silence opened up in the bay that had real weight to it. The ventilator pushed air. The monitor beeped. Outside the curtain, somewhere in the ER, she could hear voices getting louder. The second team making entry, which meant her window was closing fast. Hurst didn't move. He was a man who had built his entire professional identity on the certainty of his own judgment, and right now his judgment was in direct conflict with what his eyes were showing him, and she could see the exact shape of that conflict in his face. He wasn't stupid. She'd never thought he was stupid. He was arrogant and dismissive, and he used authority the way some people use size, to occupy space and push others out of it. But he wasn't stupid, and the monitor wasn't lying. Dr. Hurst, the transplant coordinator said carefully, if there's any question about the patient's neurological status, there isn't. But his voice had changed. The flatness was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. The curtain burst open. 2 men in suits. Behind them, Rourke. Behind him, 2 others in tactical gear that they weren't bothering to hide. The suits were holding credentials that they extended toward Hurst with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before. Special Agent Daniels, Defense Intelligence Agency, the taller one said. We have a federal patient extraction order for the individual designated John Doe in this bay. I need everyone except essential medical personnel to step back. Hurst turned. He looked at the badges, the credentials, the men behind them. Mara watched his face go through the recalibration she'd predicted. The 2 seconds of genuine uncertainty, the mental resorting of hierarchies. This is my patient, he said. But the authority in it had cracked slightly, a hairline fracture. This is a DoD asset in a federal matter, Daniel said. Your hospital's administration has been notified. You'll have documentation within the hour. Right now I need the room. You can't just... Doctor. Rourke stepped forward. His voice was quiet and completely certain. We can spend 6 minutes arguing about jurisdiction, or you can let us do what we came here to do and your patient has a chance. What we cannot do is both. The security guard at the curtain had gone very still. The transplant coordinator had stepped back against the wall with the instincts of someone who recognized an exit when she saw one. Hurst looked at Rourke, at the credentials, at the monitor, at Mara. Something happened in his face that she hadn't expected. It wasn't the arrogance failing. It was something underneath the arrogance, something more complicated. She realized, looking at him, that part of what drove him was terror. Not fear of being wrong. Fear of what wrong meant when the stakes were what they were right now. A man he'd written off and scheduled for organ harvest was showing voluntary motor response. That wasn't just a diagnostic error. That was something he would carry for the rest of his practice. She almost felt sorry for him. Almost. He stepped back. Get him stable, Swazam, he said to Mara, and she recognized it for what it was. Not an apology, not an acknowledgement, just the closest thing he could offer, which was authority seated. She was already moving. The antidote came in a cold pack case that one of the tactical team members was carrying. Mara cracked it open, checked the vials, her hands reading the labels fast, and confirmed it was what Rourke had described. Full-spectrum reversal compound, military formulary, nothing she'd ever have access to through civilian channels. She drew the dosage. She ran the math 3 times in her head, adjusting for Reyes's weight estimate and the approximate duration of exposure. I need to run this through a secondary line, she said. The existing IV is too slow for the volume. Rourke's medic, a compact woman named Santos, who'd come in with the second team and said nothing to anyone but clearly knew what she was doing, already had the secondary line kit out. They worked together without talking, which was its own form of efficiency. Santos set the line. Mara connected the infusion. She set the rate. The compound went in. She watched Reyes's face. At this stage of the reversal, the experience for the patient was, she knew from the documentation she'd read years ago, not comfortable. The return of sensation to a paralyzed body was not a pleasant thing. It was reportedly closer to being on fire in very specific ways. She'd been told about a test subject who, post-recovery, said it felt like every nerve waking up simultaneously with no filter. He'd said he'd have preferred to stay paralyzed for a while longer. Reyes's face showed nothing. No grimace, no flinch. He was trained to manage his physical responses in a way that went past conscious control. But his eyes were open, and she could see what was in them. The processing, the endurance, the absolute refusal to show anything useful to anyone who might be watching. She'd known people like that. She'd been one. 4 minutes? Santos said. Mara nodded. She checked the line, checked the rate, checked the monitor. Heart rate was climbing. 44, 51. The EEG was picking up. She became aware, gradually, of the fact that the bay around her was very crowded and very quiet. Rourke and his 2 team members, Daniels and his partner, Santos. And in the gap of the curtain, visible in the main ER beyond, she could see staff, nurses, residents, Priya with her clipboard, all stopped, watching. She ignored them. She focused on the monitor and on Reyes and on the math. At the 3-minute mark, his right hand moved. Not a twitch, a full grip, fingers closing into a fist and releasing. At 4 minutes, he turned his head toward her. At 4 minutes and 40 seconds, he tried to speak and couldn't because of the ventilator tube. "Don't," she said. "Give it another minute." He stopped trying. He looked at the ceiling instead, jaw set. At 6 minutes, she looked at Santos. Santos nodded. Mara reached for the ventilator controls. "I'm going to extubate you," she said to Reyes. "This is going to be unpleasant. You're going to want to cough. That's fine." She pulled the tube. He did cough. A rough, deep, whole-body thing that shook the bed. She had a suction catheter ready and cleared the airway, then stood back. He breathed. His own lungs, his own rate, pulling air into a body that had been motionless for hours. The monitor showed his oxygen saturation climbing. 91, 94, 96. He turned his head and looked at her. His voice, when it came, was wrecked from the tube and raw from disuse. He said, "You're not DOD." "No," she said. "Who are you?" "Mara Voss. I'm a nurse." Something shifted in his expression. "You knew the sequence?" "Yes." He looked at her for another moment, then he looked at Rourke. "Sit rep." "You're at Renner Valley General," Rourke said. 47 hours since the meet. The location on Keene Street is burned. We have a lot to debrief." "The asset?" "Unknown." Reyes closed his eyes for 2 seconds. Not the unconsciousness of a few hours ago. The deliberate, controlled blink of someone running through a calculation they don't like the answer to. "Who made contact at the garage?" "We don't know yet. Someone tipped them." "Yeah," Rourke said. "We know." The words sat in the room with considerable weight. Mara kept her attention on the monitor, on the drip rate, on the things she could measure. The conversation happening around the patient was not hers to be part of, and she was aware of that clearly. She was a nurse in a hospital where she'd been fired 20 minutes ago. Her role in this had been specific and finite, and it was nearly over. She was pulling off her gloves when Reyes said, "Hey!" She looked at him. "Thank you," he said. Flat, unembellished, the way someone said it when they meant it completely and didn't have the energy for the decorative version. "You would have come back," she said. "Eventually." "Not before they—" He stopped. "No, I wouldn't have." She nodded. She dropped the gloves in the biohazard bin and turned to tell Rourke she was done. And that's when she heard Hurst's voice behind her, from the curtain gap. He wasn't talking to her. He was on his phone pacing the main ER floor, and she caught enough of his side of the conversation to understand what he was doing. He was calling the hospital's legal department. He was calling administration. He was building the structure of an official complaint about the DIA entry, about the federal override, about Mara and what she'd administered. He wasn't wrong to make those calls. He had every right to make them. She'd violated about 12 protocols and administered an unauthorized drug combination to his patient, and regardless of the outcome, the process required documentation and accountability. She understood that. She also understood that by the time the documentation was complete and the reviews were done and the complaints were filed, his version of what had happened in Bay 4 would be the institutional record. She was a fired nurse with no standing and no backing, and Hurst was the chief of emergency surgery, and the gap between those two positions in any formal review process was very clear. Rourke appeared at her elbow. "We need to move him," he said. "Can he be transported? He needs 4 more hours of monitoring minimum. He shouldn't be moved for at least... Can he physically tolerate transport?" She looked at Reyes, who was watching the exchange with the alert, assessing the expression of someone who had already made his own decision and was waiting to see if anyone else reached the same one. "Not comfortably," she said. "That's not what I asked." She exhaled. "Yes, with monitoring, with Santos watching the line. Yes. Then we're moving in 10 minutes. She nodded and started listing what Santos would need for mobile monitoring, talking fast and specific. Santos wrote nothing down, just listened with the focused attention of someone who retained things the first time. They went through the checklist together: vitals parameters, infusion adjustments, warning signs, emergency protocols, and when they were done, Santos looked at her. "You want to come?" Santos asked. Mara blinked. "What? You know this compound better than I do right now, and he's not stable enough that I want to be the only medic on the bird." Santos said it practically, without sentiment, like she was asking about equipment. "Your call." Mara looked at the bay around her, at the hospital she'd been fired from, at the curtain gap where Hurst was still on his phone, constructing the narrative that would close this chapter of her life. At Reyes, who had turned his head to look at the ceiling with the deliberate non-expression of someone who was not going to influence her decision and was making that clear. She thought about her apartment, 3 houseplants, unread books, nothing that required anything from her. "I don't have clearance," she said. "Temporary field attachment," Rourke said from behind her. 48-hour authorization, standard protocol for civilian medical assists. "You can just do that?" "We just did." She stood there for a moment that was longer than it needed to be, which was a human failing, and she knew it. The decision was already made. It had probably been made when she'd walked past that second exit in the maintenance corridor and gone back inside the hospital instead. "Fine," she said. "What do I need to sign?" They moved Reyes on a gurney through the service corridor, bypassing the main ER entirely. Mara walked alongside the gurney managing the IV line, Santos on the other side with the monitoring equipment, Rourke and Daniels ahead clearing the path. In the ER behind them, she could hear the shift change beginning, the noise level shifting, new voices, the particular rhythm of handoff. Normal hospital morning, unremarkable, continuing without her. She'd worked there for 3 years, and the institution would metabolize her absence by noon. The loading dock was colder than the interior. The 2 Blackhawks were down in the hospital's rear parking area, which was sealed by 2 federal vehicles blocking the entrances. Ground staff she hadn't seen inside the building were positioned at intervals. The whole operation had a size to it she hadn't fully appreciated from inside. There were more people involved than she'd been shown, which was intentional. People with this level of operational experience gave you what you needed to do your job and nothing else. She helped transfer Reyes to the helicopter stretcher. He winced when they moved him, the first sign of pain he'd shown since regaining consciousness, and then controlled his face back to neutral. "Bad?" she asked. "I've had worse." "That's not an answer." 7, he said. "On your scale, if that's what you're asking." "It is." She adjusted the positioning of his right arm, which she suspected had a circulation issue from hours of immobility. "Tell me if that changes." "Noted." She climbed into the helicopter and Santos handed up the monitoring equipment and they got him situated. Rourke climbed in. Daniels did not. He closed the door and stepped back, and the engine noise escalated into something that made conversation impossible. As the Black Hawk lifted off the parking lot and banked north over Renner Valley General, Mara looked down through the window at the hospital. She could see the roof, the ambulance bay, the parking lot with the blown trash bags still against the fence. From up here, it looked small. Every place looked smaller from above. Reyes said something. She couldn't hear it over the rotors. She leaned closer. "I said, how did you know the sequence?" He had to pitch his voice up to be audible. "The tap pattern. That's not in any civilian training." She thought about how to answer that. The honest answer was complicated. The simple answer was that she'd learned it from people she'd worked alongside in a context that no longer officially existed, during a period of her life that she'd deliberately sealed behind her. I used to do something else, she said. He looked at her steadily. What? Something that made me good at this kind of problem, she said. And then I stopped. He held her gaze. He was reading her the way she was reading him, looking for the shape of what wasn't being said. She let him look. Why'd you stop? He asked. It was a question with a real answer that she wasn't going to give in the back of a moving helicopter, so she said, I got tired, which was partially true. He seemed to accept that. He looked back at the ceiling. The person who sold us out, he said, and his voice was different now, quieter, more inward. They knew exactly which agent to use. They knew the dosage window. That's not general knowledge. No, she said. That means it's someone inside. He said it without visible emotion, which she recognized as the worst kind. The things people felt nothing about were the things that had already gone past feeling. We have a team of 6 attached to this operation. 4 field, 2 support. You don't have to tell me this. I know. He looked at the window, at the gray sky moving past. We're going to a staging facility. There'll be a full debrief. They're going to go through everything. That's good? Except one of the people doing the debrief might be the one who put me in that garage. He paused. And whoever it is, they're going to know I'm alive now. She hadn't thought through that particular problem, and the fact that she hadn't thought through it landed in her stomach like something cold. An unconscious DOD asset in a hospital was inert, unthreatening. A recovered DOD asset heading to a debrief facility was a problem for the person who'd made him into the asset in the first place. She checked his monitor. Heart rate 61. Oxygen sat 97. The physical indicators were moving in the right direction. Everything else was a different matter. Is there someone you trust at the facility? She asked. One person, he said. Maybe. Maybe is not great. No, he agreed. It's not. She was quiet for a moment. Then, who? He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite trust, but the preliminary movement toward it. Someone who's been running point on this operation from the beginning. She's the one who would have authorized your field attachment. Rourke didn't authorize it? Rourke doesn't authorize anything without sign-off from above his level. Reyes glanced toward the front of the helicopter where Rourke was plugged into the crew channel and couldn't hear them. The person who authorized it knew you were here, knew what you'd done. She made a call in about 3 minutes. Mara processed that. Someone had known she was here before Rourke contacted her. Someone had known about her intervention before the biometric alert from Reyes's monitoring implant. That information chain was shorter than it should have been and ran through fewer people than was comfortable. What's her name? She asked. Reyes closed his eyes. Get some rest, she said. We can... Whitmore, he said. Deputy Director Whitmore. The helicopter banked. Through the window, the city gave way to open highway, then to the industrial fringe where the highway met the edge of county territory, and then to the kind of flat, characterless landscape that surrounded every secured facility she'd ever been in. Deliberately uninteresting, deliberately unremarkable, the geography of secrecy. Santos caught her eye over Reyes' prone form. Santos had said almost nothing since the hospital, but she was looking at Mara now with an expression that was specific and deliberate, the kind someone used when they wanted to communicate something without speaking. Mara looked back. Santos glanced at the monitoring equipment, then at the medication case, then at Mara. Mara looked at the medication case. It was a cold pack unit, standard military medical configuration, sealed with a biometric latch. But it was oriented differently than it had been when she'd first opened it. The seal was intact. She could see that clearly, but the handle was on the wrong side. Someone had moved it. Someone had moved it and resealed it and put it back in the same position, except they'd gotten the orientation wrong by 180 degrees. They'd been in transit for 11 minutes. Rourke had been in the crew channel the entire time. Santos had been on the same side of the helicopter as the case for the first 4 minutes, and opposite for the last 7. That left 2 other tactical team members sitting at the front of the passenger compartment. Mara looked at them. Both were looking forward. Neither had visible weapons in hand. One of them, the larger one, heavy-set, with a scar along his left jaw, had his right hand resting against his thigh in a position that was slightly wrong for a person sitting relaxed. The way a hand rested when it was keeping itself within reach of something. She did not look at Rourke. She did not look at Santos. She looked at the medication case and thought about what would be in it if someone had wanted something inside a case that was coming into a secured facility, and thought about what you would put in a cold pack unit that was already expected to contain pharmaceutical materials. Rhea said quietly enough that only she could hear, "Your face changed." She kept her expression neutral. "It's fine." "No," he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the ceiling. "It's not." She reached forward and placed her hand over the monitoring equipment panel, and as she did, she pressed 2 fingers against his wrist, and she tapped. 1 tap. Pause. 3 taps. She felt him go very still beneath her hand. He had understood her. There was a problem on this aircraft, and they were still 15 minutes from the ground. 15 minutes was not a lot of time, and it was also, depending on what happened in them, an enormous amount of time. Mara kept her hand on the monitoring panel and her face on the equipment, and her attention divided between 3 points in the helicopter's interior: the medication case, the heavy-set man with the scar, and the door latch on the starboard side. She was building a picture without being seen to build it, which was a skill she'd learned somewhere between her 2nd and 3rd year of doing things she no longer talked about. And it came back the way old skills did. Not with fanfare, but with the specific muscle memory clarity of something that had never really left. She checked Reyes's vitals with deliberate, visible attention, the way a medic was supposed to, and while she did, she cataloged. The heavy-set man was SFC-level build, mid-40s. The scar on his jaw was old and surgical in a way that suggested corrective repair rather than battlefield wound. His name on the deployment manifest Rourke had shown her briefly before boarding was listed as Garner. She'd registered it without meaning to. His right hand hadn't moved in 4 minutes. The second man at the front of the compartment was younger, late 20s, darker complexion, ID'd as Pelletier. He was watching the window. Genuine or performed, she couldn't tell from this angle. Santos was looking at Mara again. Mara gave her the smallest possible nod. Not confirmation, not a plan, just acknowledgement. Santos turned back to the IV line. Reyes's fingers moved against the stretcher fabric. Not the signal, just movement, his body continuing to restore itself, nerve pathways reestablishing, the compound doing its work. His color was better. His breathing had settled into a rhythm that wasn't labored. He was, by any clinical measure she had available, improving, which meant he was a more valuable problem for whoever wanted him dead than he'd been an hour ago. She leaned down slightly, adjusted the monitoring lead on his chest, routine action, entirely justified, and said very close to his ear, "The case was resealed wrong. Garner's right hand. Left side door latch is 2 feet from your position." She straightened before she finished the last word. Reyes blinked once, slowly. She went back to checking the infusion rate. The helicopter hit a patch of turbulence. Light, brief, the kind that was common at this altitude over flat terrain. And in the motion of it, Mara shifted to her right to brace, which put her 6 inches closer to the medication case and a natural arm's reach from the cold pack latch. She was not going to open it here. If she was wrong about what was in it, she'd have damaged a sealed medical asset in a federal transport. If she was right, opening it without a plan for what happened next was just a faster way to the same problem. She needed Rourke. Rourke was 3 feet away in the forward seat, still plugged into the crew channel, head partially turned toward the cockpit door. He had no line of sight to Garner's right hand from his current position. He also had no reason to suspect anything, which made him exactly the kind of resource she needed, and exactly the kind of person she couldn't alert without Garner seeing the alert. She pulled out her phone. Dead. The battery had dropped to 0 at some point in the past hour, which she'd known and not dealt with. She looked at Santos and mimed a phone with her hand. Santos reached into her vest pocket and produced a satellite phone, the military variant, thick and rubberized. She passed it across Reyes's body. Mara typed a text, no call, no sound, and kept the screen angled below the sightline of the front seats. She typed, "Garner, right hand. Case was touched. Do not react." She held the phone up toward Rourke's peripheral vision and waited. It took 9 seconds. Rourke turned his head slightly, not fully toward her, just enough to catch the screen in his peripheral field. She watched his shoulders. They didn't change. His hands didn't move. But after a moment, his head turned back to the cockpit, and he said something she couldn't hear into the crew channel. The helicopter's flight path shifted, subtle, maybe 3 degrees, but she felt it. They were not going to the staging facility. She didn't know where they were going instead, and she didn't ask because asking required speaking, and speaking required being heard. Garner moved. It wasn't dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. A person shifting their weight, apparently resettling in their seat, one hand dropping to the floor for balance. Except the hand that dropped was the right hand, and it went to the floor between his feet where the medication case was stored beside his duffel, and she saw rather than heard the soft click of the biometric latch disengaging. He had biometric clearance to that case. That meant he'd been cleared at intake as authorized medical personnel, or he'd spoofed the latch. Either way, he'd known the case was there and what was in it. She made her decision in under a second because that was all the time there was. She stood up. In a helicopter, standing up during flight was not something people did casually. It immediately drew every eye in the compartment. She didn't care. She took the 2 steps toward the front bench and planted herself between Garner and the case, and she looked at Garner directly, and she said, "Don't." He looked up at her. His face was composed, not surprised. That was the tell. A surprised person's face moves, even when they're trained, even for a fraction of a second. His didn't. He'd known this moment was coming. He'd just expected it later, at the facility, not here. "I'm checking the equipment," he said. "No," she said. "You're not." Rourke was out of his seat. Pelletier was turning. The helicopter shifted again, and she braced against the stretcher frame with her left hand, keeping her right toward Garner's arm. "Stand down, Garner," Rourke said. Garner looked from Rourke to Mara. He made a calculation she could see him making. The space, the people, the options. He was a larger person than she was, and considerably more physically trained, and she was standing in an aircraft with limited maneuvering room and no tactical equipment, and the patient she was supposed to be protecting was horizontal 2 feet behind her. What Garner had not accounted for, and what she could see him recognizing too late, was that none of those variables actually favored him. "The case," Rourke said. "Open it. Both hands where I can see them." A pause that lasted 4 seconds and felt like considerably more. Then Garner reached down, slowly, and opened the case. Inside, in the foam-cut space where 2 of the antidote vials had been stored, now empty, the vials already used and discarded, there was a secondary compartment she hadn't seen because it had been beneath the vials. It held a sealed unit the size of a thick pen, matte black, with a recessed trigger mechanism along one side. She recognized the design. Most people wouldn't. It was an aerosol delivery device, military spec, designed for close-quarters administration of an aerosolized compound in an enclosed space, like a helicopter. Pelletier said, "Jesus," and then caught himself and went quiet. Rourke put his hand on the back of Garner's neck and pushed him down onto the bench, not gently. Mara picked up the device without touching the trigger surface. She used the back of her knuckle to slide it into a Ziploc bag from the medical kit, sealed it, set it in the equipment case. Her hands were steady. Later, she would note to herself, with a detached kind of curiosity, that they were always steady at exactly the moments they should not be. "What's in it?" Rourke said. He was asking her, not Garner. "I don't know exactly," she said. "But given the presentation we saw at the hospital, probably the same class of compound. Aerosolized, this enclosed space, this altitude." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Rourke looked at Garner. "Talk." Garner said nothing. "You're going to talk," Rourke said. "The only question is to who and under what circumstances." Garner looked at the floor. His jaw was set in the way of someone who had made a decision and was holding to it, and Mara recognized that too. Not loyalty, not ideology, just the cold pragmatism of a person who had assessed their situation and concluded that talking was the worst option, which meant whoever he was working for was a more immediate threat than anything Rourke could do in the next 40 minutes. She turned to Reyes. He was watching the entire exchange from the stretcher. His color was still improving, his breathing still settling, and his expression was that of a man running a very complex assessment while lying flat on his back with an IV in his arm, which he supposed was not a new experience for him. "This is connected to Keene Street," he said. It wasn't a question. "We'll debrief at the new location," Rourke said. "It's connected," Reyes said again. Someone needed me not to make it back. Someone needed me specifically not to talk. Reyes, which means whatever I was supposed to bring back from the meet is still out there. He looked at the ceiling, and whoever wants it is still moving. Rourke was quiet for a moment, then he turned back to the crew channel and resumed a conversation that, from what Mara could see of his body language, was not pleasant for anyone involved. She sat back down beside Reyes. She checked his line, his rate, his saturation, all moving in the right direction. She adjusted the monitoring lead that had shifted during her 2 minutes of standing. "You should rest," she said. "I slept for approximately 18 hours. That wasn't sleep. He glanced at her. The first thing that was almost a wry expression she'd seen from him. Fair point. She held the monitor in her lap and watched his numbers and said nothing. Outside the window, the landscape had changed. They were over a different kind of flat, water features visible at the edge of her sightline, which put them somewhere she hadn't expected. The flight path change was more significant than 3 degrees. After a few minutes, Reyes said, "What did you do before nursing?" "I told you. Something else. You knew the tap sequence. You knew the compound class. You spotted the case reorientation that everyone else on this aircraft missed." He paused. "That's not something else. That's a specific something." She looked at him. "JSOC adjacent," she said. "Medical. That's all I'm going to say." He nodded slowly. Something in his expression settled. Not satisfaction exactly, more like a piece of information slotting into a position that made sense of other information. "Why'd you leave?" he asked. "You already asked me that." "You didn't answer." She thought about it. The real answer had several layers, and she chose the one closest to the surface. "I made a decision in the field that wasn't authorized. It worked. Somebody still decided I needed to go." Reyes was quiet for a moment. Same outcome as today. She hadn't thought of it that way. She sat with that for a second. "I suppose. Except today you came back in." "I went back in," she corrected. "There's a difference." He considered that. "Yeah," he said. "There is." The helicopter set down at a location that resolved, as they descended, into a decommissioned agricultural facility. The kind of flat-roofed metal structure that existed in 40,000 counties across the country and attracted no particular attention, surrounded by an empty parking area and accessed by an unmarked county road. There were 2 vehicles already there. Black, government plates, engines running. 3 people outside. One of them in civilian clothes, and 2 in the kind of subdued tactical gear that was designed specifically not to look like tactical gear. The civilian was a woman. She was in her 50s, Mara estimated, with gray-streaked hair pulled back practically and the kind of posture that came from decades of carrying authority without needing it confirmed by other people. She walked to the helicopter as the rotors were still spinning down, which told Mara something about her, and she opened the side door herself rather than waiting for one of the men with her to do it, which told her something more. She looked at Reyes first, assessed him the way a physician would, quick, complete, taking in color, position, breathing, the line in his arm. Then she looked at Mara. "You're Voss," she said. "Yes." "Elaine Whitmore." She didn't extend a hand. They were both in a moving situation, but the introduction was direct and unambiguous. "You did good work today." Mara wasn't sure what to do with that, so she said, "He needs to get horizontal for at least another 2 hours. His autonomic function is still stabilizing, and I'd want a proper monitoring setup before anyone debriefs him." Whitmore nodded. "We have medical inside." She looked at Garner, who was being helped out of the helicopter by Rourke with the specific grip that communicated constraint without looking like it. Her expression didn't change. "Get him to the room," she said to Rourke. "Deputy Director," Rourke said, "we need to discuss—" "I know what we need to discuss." She looked at the bagged aerosol unit that Mara was carrying in the equipment case. "Is that it?" "Yes." Whitmore looked at it. Her face was unreadable in the specific way of someone who had learned to make it unreadable over a long time. "Come inside," she said. Inside was a large single-room operations setup that had been constructed within the agricultural building. Prefab walls, suspended lighting, equipment tables running along the far side, screens mounted to the prefab with tactical feeds and communications links. the kind of infrastructure that went up in 6 hours and came down in 4. Temporary but functional, the operational equivalent of an army cot. Not comfortable, not meant to be, entirely adequate. They got Reyes onto a proper monitoring setup, and a medic Mara hadn't met. Mid-30s, bearded, introduced himself as Falk, took over the IV management after Mara walked him through the dosing history. She stayed nearby. Not hovering, just present, which was a nurse's version of not leaving. Whitmore sat up at the table with Rourke and Daniels, and 2 other people Mara didn't have names for, and they had a conversation in lowered voices that lasted about 8 minutes, during which Garner was in a separate room and the aerosol unit had been taken away by someone in gloves and a sealed bag. When they were done, Whitmore walked to where Mara was standing near the monitoring station and said, "I want to understand the timeline from the hospital." Mara gave it to her. Clear, chronological, no editorial. The puncture mark, the tap test, the drug protocol, the confrontation with Hurst, the loading dock, the helicopter. When she got to the reoriented case, she described what she'd observed without speculation. Whitmore listened without interrupting. When Mara finished, Whitmore said, "When did you decide something was wrong on the aircraft?" "When I saw the case was reoriented." "Not before?" "I noticed Garner's hand position when we boarded, but that was preliminary. Positioning could be coincidence. The case confirmed it." "And you made the call to stand up rather than communicate to Rourke first." "I had the phone text out to Rourke, but Garner was already moving to the case and the text hadn't landed yet. If I'd waited, he'd have had the device in hand." Whitmore considered that. "If you'd been wrong about the device, you'd have looked like you'd assaulted a federal agent in an active transport." "Yes," Mara said. "Were you worried about that?" "After," she said. "Not during." Something in Whitmore's expression shifted slightly. Not warmth exactly. More like recognition. "You said you were JSOC adjacent medical." "I said that." "What unit?" Mara looked at her steadily. "I'd rather not." "I'm asking because it matters." "I know it matters." "I'd still rather not." Whitmore held her gaze for a moment. Then, "All right, we'll leave it." She glanced toward where Reyes was on the monitoring station, awake, watching them. "He's going to need a specific type of support through the debrief. He trusted you on that aircraft. That matters for what comes next." "What comes next for him is medical stabilization," Mara said. "The debrief should wait 6 hours minimum. We may not have 6 hours. He may not have reliable recall in less than 6 hours. The compound affects short-term formation during the acute phase. Anything you debrief in the next 3 hours has a good chance of being partially constructed rather than retrieved. That's not useful to you, and it's not fair to him." Whitmore's eyes moved to Reyes. She said, "Is that accurate?" Reyes from the monitoring station said, "She's not wrong." "I rarely am about medical things," Mara said. Whitmore almost smiled. It was a small, precise movement that was there and gone. 3 hours, she said. Then we need him. 3 hours, Mara agreed. Falk turned out to be competent, which was a relief. He ran the monitoring setup with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done military field medicine long enough for the unusual to become routine, and he and Mara worked the next 2 hours in the specific professional shorthand of 2 medical people with different training who were after the same result. She managed the infusion taper, he managed the cardiovascular monitoring, and they consulted twice on adjustments and agreed both times, which was better than the alternative. Reyes slept for 90 of those minutes. Real sleep. Not the chemically imposed shutdown of before, the deep regular breathing of a body processing repair. Mara sat near the monitoring station and drank bad coffee that someone had produced from a drip machine in the corner and let herself be still for the first time since 7:43 that morning. She thought about the hospital, about Bay 4, about the fact that she had been fired before any of this began and would return, when she returned, if she returned, to a hospital whose chief of emergency surgery had promised to end her career. She thought about the organ donation coordinator with the lanyard, who had been doing her job correctly and had nearly participated in something catastrophic because the diagnostic process had failed. She thought about Trevor, who had put down his supply cart and walked away and had probably spent the last 4 hours trying to decide if he'd done the right thing. She thought about Hurst making his phone calls. building his version of the morning into institutional record. She was not without recourse. She knew that. She had documentation, she had Rourke, she had Whitmore, none of which was usable in a way that Hearst would accept, because the federal involvement was the kind that didn't appear in official form. She would return to Renner Valley, if she returned, as a fired nurse with no backing anyone would admit to, and Hearst's version would be the one on file, and the review board would see what the review board saw. She'd been there before. Different context. Same basic geometry. Reyes woke up. He came out of it the way she'd noticed combat-trained people tended to. Not gradually, not the slow surfacing of an ordinary person, but abrupt and complete, from sleep to present in under 3 seconds. His eyes opened and focused, and he turned his head and found her immediately. "How long?" he asked. "Hour and a half." He tried to sit up. She put a hand on his shoulder. Light, not restraining. "Slowly," she said. He sat up slowly. She watched his face for the indicators she'd been monitoring clinically. The color, the eye focus, the bilateral grip strength she'd been checking every hour. He looked better. Still not good in any absolute sense, but better in the specific way of someone moving in the right direction. "Garner's being held," he said. "It wasn't a question. In a room down the hall." "Has he talked?" "Not that I've been told." He looked at his hands. "He won't. Not voluntarily." He flexed his fingers, testing them. "He's waiting for someone to extract him. He's in a secured location with federal agents." "I know where he is." Reyes looked at her. "Whoever he's working for has the resources to put a device like that in a cold pack on a DoD medical transport. They have reach inside our operation. Garner thinks that reach extends here." "Does it?" Reyes considered that for a moment too long. "I don't know," he said finally, and she respected the honesty of it, the refusal to perform certainty he didn't have. "Whitmore scheduled your debrief in about an hour," she said. "You should eat something before then. Your blood sugar has been inconsistent." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "You've been tracking my blood sugar." "It's a monitoring station. Everything gets tracked." "Right." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you. For the food recommendation. That's—" He stopped. "I was going to say that's not usually what I need after a mission. What do you usually need?" He thought about it. "Scotch and solitude, in roughly that order. The scotch is probably going to have to wait." "Yeah," he almost smiled. "The solitude too, apparently. Someone brought food, packaged sandwiches and water bottles, the kind of meal that made no attempt to be anything other than functional." Reyes ate methodically and completely, which told her the nausea phase of the reversal had passed. She drank more bad coffee and ate half a sandwich and watched the monitoring feeds with the peripheral attention of someone who could read numbers without looking directly at them. Whitmore appeared at 1/4 the hour. "We're ready when you are," she said. Reyes looked at Mara. "You should be in the debrief." Whitmore's expression held. "That's, She identified the compound class from a visual and a pulse assessment. She has the complete medical timeline from intake." He looked at Whitmore. "And she's the reason I'm having a debrief instead of being distributed across 3 different patients." Whitmore was quiet for a moment, then, "Voss, conference room, intact." The debrief was 3 people in a room with a table and recording equipment, Whitmore, Reyes, and an analyst named Kaminsky, who had the kind of quiet intensity of someone who processed information the way other people breathed. Mara sat against the wall. Not at the table. She was there as medical support, and she stayed in that lane. Reyes gave the operational timeline from the top. His voice was measured throughout. Not flat, not performed calm. Just the deliberate pacing of someone who understood that accuracy mattered more than drama. The meet on Keene Street was a scheduled handoff from a domestic asset who had been running a parallel track inside a procurement network attached to a federal defense contractor. The asset had information about a classified materials diversion, specific quantities of a compound class that had exactly one primary application, which was not the application listed on the procurement documents. He got to the garage. The handoff went wrong. Not the usual kind of wrong, not an ambush from outside, but a meeting that had already been terminated. The asset wasn't there. What was there was a 2-person team who knew Reyes's face, knew his cover identity, knew the frequency he'd be monitoring. They'd had the compound ready. They weren't there to extract information, Reyes said. They weren't going to take me somewhere and ask questions. They just needed me to not make it back. Because you'd already received the handoff, Kaminsky said. Before the garage. Partial transfer at the secondary location. I had enough. Whitmore and Kaminsky exchanged a look. Where is it? Whitmore asked. Here. He tapped his temple. Kaminsky leaned forward. Walk us through it. Reyes gave numbers. Specific, sequential. The product of whatever the asset had transferred before the meet went wrong. The quantities, the routing documentation, the contractor ID strings. Mara didn't follow all of it. The procurement specifics were outside her knowledge base, but she followed enough to understand the shape. Materials that should have been destroyed had been diverted. The diversion was documented in a way that obscured it through 3 layers of subsidiary contracting, but the documentation existed and the numbers Reyes was providing were enough to reconstruct it. Kaminsky typed continuously. When Reyes finished, the room was quiet for a moment. This is enough to open a formal investigation, Whitmore said. This is enough to arrest 6 people, Reyes said. The question is who knew we were at Keene Street? Kaminsky's typing stopped. The operation manifest shows... I know what the manifest shows. Reyes looked at Whitmore. Garner was on the secondary support team. He wasn't on the primary operation. He shouldn't have had the flight manifest. Whitmore's face, which had been a controlled instrument for the entire debrief, showed something for the first time. A compression around the eyes. Something that might have been anger or might have been the specific kind of exhaustion that came from confirming something you'd already suspected. Who put him on the secondary team? Mara asked from the wall. 3 sets of eyes turned to her. She hadn't planned to speak. It came out of a thought process she'd been running parallel to the debrief, and it was a real question with an answer that mattered. The secondary team assignments came from, Kaminsky started. From logistics and support, Whitmore said. She said it quietly and completely, the way someone said something they'd been waiting to say for a while. Which is supervised by Deputy Director Harlan. Reyes went very still. Harlan, he said. I don't have confirmation, Whitmore said. This is... You've been looking at him? I've been looking at several people. You've been looking at him, Reyes said again. Not aggressive, certain. The certainty of someone who knew how to read the structure of information even when the information wasn't being offered. Whitmore didn't confirm it. She also didn't deny it. The room processing took about 4 seconds, and then Kaminsky said, If Harlan knew about Keene Street... He knows Reyes is alive, Mara said. Kaminsky looked at her. Garner was supposed to complete what the garage team started, she said. When we took the device, Garner had no way to communicate that. He was under Rourke's control, but someone else on this operation will check in, or fail to. And that failure to check in will tell Harlan that the asset is alive, in custody, and has already talked. She paused. How long since we landed? Whitmore looked at her watch. 94 minutes. Is there a scheduled communication window for this operation? Whitmore and Kaminsky exchanged another look, this one faster and harder. Every 90 minutes, Kaminsky said. Then he already knows, Mara said. The lights went out. Not a brownout. Not a flicker. A complete instantaneous loss of power that took the screens, the monitoring feeds, the suspended lighting, and the communications equipment simultaneously and left the room in the flat gray of an interior space with no windows. From somewhere outside the building, not far outside, close enough that she felt it more than heard it at first, came a low resonant vibration. Then sound. Rotor blades. Not the same Blackhawks from the hospital. These were bigger, lower frequency. Mara was out of her chair before the emergency lighting engaged, which it did 3 seconds later, red-tinted, casting everything in the color of a problem. She was moving toward Reyes, not running, no room to run, but moving fast and deliberate through the unfamiliar space. Whitmore was already at the door. She pulled it open and spoke to someone in the hallway in a voice that was lower and harder than anything she'd used in the debrief room. Reyes was trying to get off the table, and the IV line pulled tight as he moved. Mara caught it before it tore, reached up and clamped the line, and in the same motion helped him get upright. He swayed for exactly 1 second, his body still not entirely reliable. And then he planted himself. "Exit?" he said. "I don't know this building." "Find Rourke." Falk appeared in the door behind Whitmore, looking at the monitoring equipment that had gone dead with the power. He was carrying a portable unit, battery backup, smaller, limited capability. He looked at Reyes standing and processed it without comment. "We need to move him," Mara said. "I can move myself," Reyes said. "You can stand. That's not the same thing, and you know it." Rourke came through the door at a controlled jog, which was the fastest she'd seen him move. He was carrying something that was definitely not the sidearm she'd seen holstered on him earlier, larger, and he was holding it in a way that suggested immediate use. "We have 2 aircraft inbound," he said. "Not ours." "Harlan?" Whitmore said. "Unknown affiliation? The markings?" He stopped. "There are no markings." The building shook. Not an impact, more like something heavy setting down very close to the structure. Then the sound changed, dropping in frequency, which meant the rotors were slowing. Whatever had landed was landing. And then, from the far end of the facility, through the prefab wall, through what had been the equipment table area, a sound that was very specific and very clear, the particular, unmistakable crack of a breaching charge. They were already inside. Mara had her hand on Reyes's arm, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and they both looked at the door at the far end of the room, which was the only door that led toward that sound, and the door was opening. The first figure came through fast and low, wearing tactical gear that had no unit designation, no service branch, no identification of any kind, blank equipment, the kind that said this never happened by design. The second came through behind and to the right in the overlapping pattern of a practiced 2-man entry. Rourke raised his weapon. The figure in front raised his and said, "Stand down! Stand down! We are federal marshals." "Identification," Rourke said. "Stand down." "Identification." The figure reached with his offhand toward his vest. Mara watched Reyes watching the movement. Not the hand going to the vest. The other hand, the weapon hand. She watched the weapon hand because that was what mattered. The weapon hand moved. It moved wrong. And she was already moving when Reyes shouted her name. The weapon hand moved and Mara dropped, not away from it, toward it. Toward the gap between the 2 entry figures where the angle was wrong for a clean shot at either Rourke or Reyes, where her body crossing the space would interrupt the firing line for exactly the 2 seconds that Rourke needed. She hit the floor on her shoulder and rolled and came up against the near equipment table, and the shot that would have gone somewhere useful went into the prefab wall instead, and Rourke fired twice in the same breath, controlled, measured, the sound enormous in the enclosed space. And the first figure went down, and the second figure took the wall with one hand and recalculated. Reyes was moving. He shouldn't have been moving. He was still 20% of the way through a neurological recovery, and his proprioception wasn't fully restored, and she'd watched him sway standing still 40 minutes ago. But he was moving anyway, crossing the room in a way that was not graceful, but was absolutely purposeful. And he hit the second figure in a controlled tackle that took them both into the doorframe. Mara stayed low. She looked for the weapon the first figure had dropped and found it under the equipment table where it had slid, and she put her hand on it and then stopped, because she was a nurse and she had not fired a weapon in 6 years, and the moment of reaching for it was also the moment of understanding exactly what reaching for it meant. She held it. The second figure and Reyes were in the doorframe. The second figure was larger and in better physical condition and had the specific advantage of being fully functional, and Reyes's grip was slipping. She could see it from across the room, the arm that had been paralyzed for 18 hours, losing the fight, with a body that was still not entirely his. She crossed the room. She put the weapon against the back of the second figure's neck, at the precise point where the helmet's lower edge met skin, and she said very clearly, "Stop." He stopped. Rourke was behind her in the next second, and the situation resolved itself into the specific shape of something that was over without being finished. The second figure went face down. Zip ties from Rourke's vest. Fast and efficient, the practiced motion of someone who had done this before and would do it again and had no feelings about it either way. Reyes straightened up against the doorframe. He was breathing harder than he'd been breathing before, which she noted clinically. His right hand had a tremor that hadn't been there at the monitoring station. He saw her see it and didn't do anything about it, which she appreciated. "How many more?" he said to Rourke. Outside? Unknown. Whitmore has Kaminsky and 2 field agents on the perimeter. Where's Garner? Rourke's face answered before he did. Garner's room was the first breach point. Reyes absorbed that. Gone or dead? Gone. Rourke looked at the floor for exactly 1 second, which was all the time he apparently allocated to that kind of failure, and then he looked back up. Vehicle tracks in the east side of the lot. They were already moving when the aircraft came in. The aircraft was cover. The aircraft was a distraction, Mara said. Both of them looked at her. A clean extraction wouldn't announce itself with a breaching charge, she said. They needed everyone's attention at the breach point. While we were responding in here, someone picked up Garner from the other side. A pause. They planned it from before we landed, Reyes said. Garner had a window between the aircraft and this room when no one had eyes on him, maybe 4 minutes. That's enough to signal. She set the weapon down on the equipment table. She had no interest in holding it longer than necessary, and looked at her own hand. It was steady. She'd known it would be. She was still not entirely sure how she felt about that. The 2 men in here were expendable. They weren't here to succeed, they were here to occupy us. Rourke already had his phone out, relaying exactly this to whoever was on the other end, and his voice had the flat urgency of someone transmitting rather than conversing. Mara looked at Reyes. Sit down, she said. I'm fine. Your hand is shaking and your color dropped about 30 seconds ago. Sit down. He looked at the equipment table and then sat on the floor next to it, which she hadn't expected. She crouched next to him and checked his pulse. Still elevated from the exertion, stronger than it had been, but his heart rate was sitting around 93 and his breathing was coming down. The tremor in his right hand was already less pronounced. I'm not going to fall over, he said. I know. But if I let you stand for the next hour being operational, you'll crash hard around hour 3, and that will be considerably worse. She kept 2 fingers on his wrist and looked at his face. The reversal compound is still working. You pushed against it. Let it catch up. He looked at the ceiling. I hate this part. What part? The part where I can't... He stopped, started differently. I'm used to being able to. Everyone is, she said. Nobody's used to not being able to. He didn't respond to that. After a moment he said, Thank you. For the floor. She knew what he meant. The drop she'd taken to interrupt the firing line. She said, It was the most direct option. It was a stupid option for someone without a vest. It worked. This time. He looked at her. The conversation had gone somewhere slightly past their professional geography, and they both seemed to recognize it at the same moment, and they both let it settle back to where it belonged. Whitmore came through the door, with a cut on her forearm that she wasn't bothering to deal with yet, and the expression of someone who had made several decisions in the last 8 minutes, and was already preparing for the next several. She took in the room, the 2 downed figures, Rourke on the phone, Reyes on the floor with Mara crouched next to him, and nodded in the way of someone who has accounted for a situation and moved on. The aircraft is gone, she said. Perimeter is clear. Garner has a vehicle moving west on County Road 14 that we're tracking, but the vehicle doesn't have a federal transponder, so the track is civilian cell tower inference, and it's going to be slow. She looked at Reyes. I need to make a call. Make it, he said. Harlan is in Washington. He's been in a meeting at the Defense Oversight Committee since 9 this morning. She said this carefully. The way someone presented information that was meant to look like an alibi and didn't quite succeed. His office has him documented through noon. He doesn't need to be in the room for any of this, Reyes said. No, Whitmore said. He doesn't. She looked at the blank tactical gear of the figure on the floor, the absence of any identifying marks. But proving that connection is a different problem. We have the device from the helicopter, Mara said, which we can tie to Garner. Tying Garner to Harlan requires Garner's communication log, Kaminsky said from the doorway. He was holding a tablet, and his expression was the particular focused brightness of someone who had found something. Garner's sat phone was in the evidence bag from the helicopter. I've been pulling the transmission metadata for the past 40 minutes. Whitmore turned. 3 transmissions in the 6 hours before the operation, Kaminsky said. 2 of them routed through a relay node that's assigned to logistics and support. Assigned to Harlan's office, Reyes said. Assigned to the division. We'd need to pull the specific allocation records to narrow. Pull them, Whitmore said. I already did. Kaminsky looked at his tablet. The relay node was allocated to a single user during those transmission windows. The allocation request was filed under a contractor ID that doesn't appear in our system. Ghost ID, Rourke said. He'd finished his call and was listening. Ghost ID, Kaminsky confirmed. But the filing metadata, the timestamp, the IP origin, the system it was filed from, all of that is logged automatically. The origin system is a workstation registered to Deputy Director Harlan's personal office suite. The room was quiet. Not the quiet of people absorbing information. The quiet of people watching something become true that they had known for a while and had needed this moment to make official. Whitmore's face, which had been controlled and precise for hours, did something complicated. It didn't break. She was not a person who broke, but something in it shifted, some weight redistributing, the invisible adjustment of someone dealing with a betrayal they'd had time to prepare for and were still not entirely ready for. "How long have you known?" Reyes asked. She looked at him. 6 weeks? 6 weeks. I had indicators, not proof. You don't move against a deputy director with indicators. She looked at the floor briefly. I put you on the Keene Street operation because it was the fastest path to documentation. The assets information would have given us the procurement evidence. That was always the primary. You knew the operation was compromised, Reyes said. Not with anger, with the flatness of someone reassembling a timeline they'd been given incorrectly. You put me in a location that someone inside had already flagged. I didn't know it had been flagged. I knew Harlan had visibility into the operation structure. I thought the compartmentalization was sufficient. It wasn't. No, she said. It wasn't. She didn't soften it. She didn't add anything to it. She let it sit. Reyes looked at the ceiling for 3 seconds. Then, the asset. What happened to them? Kaminsky and Whitmore exchanged a look that was 3 words long, and none of them were good. We don't know, Whitmore said. They didn't surface after the meet went sideways. We have a flag on their cover ID, but no activity. The room absorbed that. Mara had stayed very quiet through this exchange, sitting on the floor next to Reyes with her hand on his wrist, monitoring his pulse by touch, and she had listened to the entire thing with the specific attention of someone who was making herself understand a system she hadn't been inside before. What she understood was this. A senior official had known about an investigation into his own conduct, had used his position to compromise the operative running the evidence gathering, and had nearly succeeded in making that operative permanently unavailable. The asset who'd transferred the information might already be dead. The evidence existed in Reyes's recall and in Kaminsky's tablet, and that evidence had a deputy director's workstation metadata attached to it. And Harlan was currently in a meeting in Washington with documented attendance, which meant he was building his own version of today for exactly the same reasons Hearst had been on the phone, building his version of the morning. You need to move now, she said. Whitmore looked at her. Before he's out of that meeting, before he knows exactly what we have. She looked at Kaminsky. How long to authenticate the metadata? I can have a preliminary package together in 40 minutes. Full authentication requires the preliminary package, Mara said. What can you prove with that alone? Kaminsky thought about it. Communication link between the relay node and Garner in the operational window. Workstation registration to Harlan's suite. It's not a conviction, but it's enough for a suspension and a formal investigation, Whitmore said. Enough for an arrest, Kaminsky said quietly. Whitmore straightened. She looked at her watch. She looked at Rourke. Get me a secure line to the director's office. Not Harlan's division, direct to the director. Rourke moved. Whitmore looked at Reyes. I need you on that call. Your testimony about the Keene Street meet, the garage, everything you transmitted to Kaminsky. That forms the operational record. The director needs to hear it from you. Reyes put his hand on the equipment table and pushed himself up. Mara stood with him. He was steadier than he'd been on the floor. She checked his eyes. Pupils equal, reactive, tracking correctly. 1 minute, she said to Whitmore. Whitmore nodded and stepped out with Kaminsky. Mara looked at Reyes. You need to eat something else before that call, she said. Your blood sugar is still uneven and I can tell from your focus. I'm focused fine. You're focused the way someone is when they're compensating. There's a difference. She looked around the room and found the packaged food that had been brought in earlier, still on the side table, untouched in the chaos. She handed him a protein bar. He looked at it. "I know," she said. "Eat it anyway." He ate it without further argument, which told her more about his current state than the monitoring equipment had. "Harlan," he said while he was eating, "he's been in my division for 11 years. She didn't say anything. She let him have the thought. "I worked a joint task force with him in 2019. He was—" He stopped. "It doesn't matter. It matters to you." "It shouldn't." "It does anyway," she said. "That's not a problem. That's how people work." He looked at her with an expression she recognized, the slight surprise of someone who has been treated like a person instead of an operational asset and doesn't have an immediate response to it. "How do you do this?" he asked. "Do what?" "All of it. Today. The hospital, the aircraft, just now." He looked at the door where the two downed figures were still on the floor with zip ties, where there were bullet holes in the prefab wall. "You came back for nursing." "I came back because I needed something to do," she said, "and I was good at it. Both things." "You're also good at this." "I know." She said it without false modesty and without satisfaction, just as a fact. That's the problem. He didn't ask her to explain it. She thought, later, that was probably why she offered the explanation anyway. "When you're good at two things and one of them involves people getting shot at," she said, "you have to pick which one you want to build a life around. I picked the one that didn't. And now—" She looked at him steadily. "Ask me in about 6 hours." The call to the director's office took 22 minutes, and Mara was not in the room for it. She was in the main operations area, helping Falk reassemble the monitoring setup on backup power, listening to the building settle back into its functional state around her. The emergency lighting had been replaced by the actual lights once they'd identified and reset the breaker that the entry team had killed. The screens were back up. The facility felt smaller now than it had when they'd arrived, the scale of the situation filling it, pressing against the temporary walls. She thought about Renner Valley General, about the exact moment the morning had shifted, the moment she'd stood over the gurney in Bay 4 and seen the puncture mark behind a dead man's ear, and felt something reorient inside her. Not a decision, not yet. Just the recognition that the situation required something she had. She'd spent 3 years trying to not be required. Rourke found her at the monitoring station. "Call's done," he said. "What happened?" The director issued a suspension order for Harlan, effective immediately pending formal investigation. Rourke said it matter-of-factly, but she could hear something underneath it. Not satisfaction, not quite. More like the particular relief of a very long-held breath. Federal marshals, actual ones, are executing the suspension at the DOC meeting, right now, while he's in the room. She thought about that. Harlan in a room full of oversight committee members and federal officials, suspension papers handed to him by marshals, his access cards deactivating in real time. The public geometry of a man whose position had seemed unassailable 20 minutes ago being visibly, officially, and irrevocably removed from it. "Garner?" she asked. "Vehicle track found the car on County Road 14, abandoned. They're running the surrounding area. He didn't get far. There's no infrastructure out there for a sustained egress." Rourke paused. "He'll surface." "Will he talk then?" "With Harlan in federal custody and no one to protect him from?" "Yeah," Rourke said. "He'll talk." Whitmore came out of the conference room and crossed the operations floor with the direct, economical movement of someone who had just completed one phase of something and was already oriented toward the next. She stopped near Mara. "The director wants Reyes's full debrief documented and submitted by tomorrow morning," she said, "which means we're here tonight." She paused. "You're here tonight, if that's acceptable." "My other plans fell through," Mara said. Whitmore's mouth moved. "The hospital called. Renner Valley." Mara went still. Administration contacted the DIA liaison office looking for information about the operation at their facility this morning. They're aware federal agents were present, that a patient was transported, and that a member of their nursing staff was, Whitmore chose the word carefully, involved. What did the liaison tell them? As little as possible, which is standard, but the call was made by the hospital's chief of staff, not Dr. Hurst, which means Hurst's complaints went up the chain internally, and the chain above him had questions the liaison office couldn't ignore. What does that mean practically? It means Hearst's documentation of this morning has been flagged for internal review by the hospital's own administration. Before the DIA said a word about your role. Whitmore looked at her. Apparently, when your chief of staff calls a federal agency trying to understand why Army helicopters landed in their back parking lot and a nurse was involved in a federal operation, and that federal agency is cautiously non-committal, the chief of staff starts asking different questions about why the nurse was fired in the first place. Mara didn't say anything. I'm not telling you this has resolved itself, Whitmore said. I'm telling you the situation has shifted. Hearst will fight it. Hearst is going to find that fighting it gets considerably harder when the federal record shows that his diagnostic assessment of a DOD asset was incorrect and that the unauthorized intervention by his nursing staff prevented an irreversible error. Whitmore paused. That's not an official finding yet, but the record exists, and it will be part of whatever review process Renner Valley initiates. Mara absorbed this, not with the dramatic quality it might have deserved, just quietly, the way she absorbed most things, fully and without visible reaction, and with the full weight of it registering somewhere underneath. I don't want Hearst destroyed, she said. Whitmore looked at her. I'm sorry? He was wrong. He was arrogant and dismissive, and his diagnostic process failed in a way that nearly killed your asset. But he's been right 100 times before today, and he'll probably be right 100 times after. He shouldn't practice differently. He should practice better. She kept her voice level. I want the record to reflect what happened. I don't want him handed to an institution that will make an example of him to protect itself. Whitmore was quiet for a moment. That's a more measured position than I expected. What did you expect? Less generosity towards someone who called you unqualified to touch a mop. Mara thought about Hearst's face in the moment she'd seen it shift, the arrogance giving way to something more complicated, the territory under the certainty. He believed what he said. He was wrong, but he believed it. She paused. That's a different problem than someone who knows they're wrong and says it anyway. Whitmore looked at her steadily. People like you are unusual, she said. People who don't want revenge. People who understand the difference between accountability and destruction. She said it without sentimentality, just as an observation. Both of those are rarer than they should be. Dautat. Reyes came out of the conference room an hour later. He was moving better. The 6-hour monitoring window Mara had argued for had not fully materialized, but he'd gotten close enough that his system had largely stabilized, and the visible difference from the man she'd sat next to on the helicopter floor was substantial. He was still not at full capacity, and she could see the effort underneath the steadiness, the energy he was spending to appear more functional than he was. She'd seen that before. It was a trained behavior, and it was also just stubbornness, which was not always a liability. He found her in the main operations area and handed her a cup of coffee. Real coffee this time. Someone had found an actual machine somewhere, and said, Harlan was suspended 40 minutes ago. I heard. In the room, with the full committee present. She looked at him. How do you feel about that? He thought about it seriously, which she'd noticed was his habit. Not performing consideration, but actually doing it. Like it's the right thing. Like it's still... He stopped. Like both things can be true. They can, she said. I know. He drank his coffee. Garner was picked up 20 minutes ago. A farm road about 2 miles from the abandoned car. He didn't have support infrastructure. They pulled him out of the operation before they built any, probably because the plan was for him to fly in on the helicopter and exit in the confusion. He paused. The plan didn't account for a nurse who spots case reorientations. The plan had several gaps, she said. You closed most of them. She didn't respond to that. She drank the coffee, which was significantly better than anything she'd had since the break room at Renner Valley, and she was aware of being grateful for small things in a way that was probably a function of the kind of day it had been. Outside, through the metal walls of the facility, she could hear vehicles, new ones, arriving in a pattern that suggested something official was being assembled. She looked at Rourke through the operations room window and caught him looking back. What's happening outside, Shah? She asked. Reyes followed her gaze. DOJ team. The director's office sent them. They're here for the formal evidence collection and to take custody of the 2 people we have in that room. That was fast. The director moves fast when a deputy director is being arrested. Nobody wants to be slow on that record. He paused. They're also going to want your statement. She'd expected this. Okay. It'll be formal, recorded. Your name and role will be in the federal record attached to this operation. She considered what that meant. Her name attached to a classified operation that would be sealed for a decade. Her role described in language that would not match the title on her nursing badge. 3 years of careful smallness, of moving through Renner Valley General like a shadow, suddenly ending in a federal record that described a different version of the person she'd spent 3 years pretending not to be. Okay, she said again. He looked at her. You're sure? I've been sure about most things today that I probably should have second-guessed more. The corner of his mouth moved. It was a minor thing, and she'd noticed he did it in place of a larger expression, the compressed version of something that would have been a real smile if he'd had more energy or a different kind of history. That's not a no. That's not a no, she agreed. Outside, a car door closed. Then another. Voices, professional and contained. The sound of something official arriving to account for the morning's consequences. Mara finished her coffee. She thought about Garner in federal custody, about Harlan's access cards deactivating in a room full of committee members, about the procurement evidence in Kaminsky's tablet, the ghost ID and the workstation metadata, the numbers Reyes had carried out of Keene Street in his head, and across 18 hours of pharmacological shutdown and a helicopter threat, and a breaching charge, and all of it leading here to a prefab operations room in an unmarked agricultural facility, where the morning was finally becoming paperwork. Accountability without destruction, she'd said to Whitmore. The record reflecting what happened. She was thinking about that when Whitmore appeared in the doorway of the operations room and said her name. She looked up. Whitmore's expression was careful, not closed. Careful. The expression of someone who had information and was deciding how to deliver it. The DOJ team brought something, Whitmore said. It was in Harlan's office, his personal office, not division records. They found it during the suspension sweep when his system access was cut and a timed document lock activated. Timed locks activate when access is revoked, standard procedure, and they flag for evidence collection. What was it? Mara asked. Whitmore looked at her for a moment, then at Reyes, then back at Mara. A personnel file, she said, sealed and classified, 6 years old. She paused. With your name on it. Mara stopped. The operations room was very quiet. The name on the file, Whitmore said carefully. It's not Mara Voss. The name on the file was Kira Solano. Mara stood in the operations room and heard Whitmore say it and felt something happen in her chest that wasn't quite pain and wasn't quite relief, but was some combination of the two that didn't have a clean word. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 6 years. She'd been careful about that. She'd been careful about most things, and careful most consistently about that. Where did he get it? She asked. Her voice came out level. She was distantly aware that it shouldn't have. We don't know yet, Whitmore said. The file is sealed at a classification level that Harlan shouldn't have had access to, which means either he cultivated a source who did, or someone gave it to him. Why? Reyes said. Not to Whitmore. To Mara. She looked at him. He was watching her with the direct, patient attention of someone who had been read correctly all day and was now reading back, and she'd known since the helicopter that this moment was probably coming, the moment where the incomplete version of herself she'd offered became insufficient. Sit down, she said, both of you. They sat. Whitmore took the chair across the table. Reyes sat on the edge of the equipment table with the monitoring unit behind him still running its numbers, and he looked at her and waited. She stood. She was not someone who needed to sit for difficult things. She'd always processed better on her feet. Kira Solano is the name I used for 6 years in a JSO C-adjacent intelligence role, she said. Medical cover, but operational. I ran medical intelligence assessments for direct action teams, threat analysis, compound medical evaluation, personnel health profiling for HVT operations. I was embedded with units I wasn't officially assigned to, under documentation that didn't connect back to my civilian record. She kept her voice flat. Not performing calm, actually calm, the way she was always calm when the thing being discussed was operational and distant from the present moment. I left that work after an operation in which I made an unauthorized medical decision in the field. The decision saved the target. It also exposed a protocol that certain people in the oversight chain wanted kept buried. What protocol? Whitmore asked. An interrogation protocol that produced medically invalid information because the physical state of the subjects made reliable disclosure impossible. She said it plainly. I documented it. I submitted the documentation through proper channels. The documentation was classified, reassigned, and buried. 3 weeks later, I was separated from the program with a sealed record and a non-disclosure agreement and a civilian identity that was, I was told, clean. Maravos? Reyes said. Maravos? She looked at the wall for a moment. My mother's first name, my grandmother's surname. I wasn't creative. Who handled your separation? Whitmore asked. She looked at Whitmore directly. Logistics and support, she said. 6 years ago, when the division was under different leadership. The room was quiet. Whitmore's expression had shifted into something concentrated and very still. Who specifically? A deputy director, Mara said. His name was in the separation paperwork. I memorized it because I memorized things I might need. She paused. His name was Harlan. The quiet in the room became a different kind of quiet. Reyes said very carefully, he processed your separation. He signed the documentation. Whether he processed it personally or delegated, I don't know. But his name is on the forms I signed. And now his personal files contain your classified personnel record, Whitmore said, under my operational name, which means someone maintained the connection between Kira Solano and Mara Voss after the separation, even though the entire purpose of the separation process was to sever that connection. She felt something hard and factual settle in her chest. He's known who I was this whole time. He just didn't need to use it until today. Until you complicated his operation, Reyes said. Until I complicated his operation, she agreed. Whitmore stood up. She moved to the operations board and looked at the screens without seeing them, working something through that required the physical act of standing to process. The file is leverage, she said finally. He kept it as leverage. On you specifically. On anyone who might be difficult to predict, Mara said. He separated people and kept the connections. That's a pattern, not an exception. Whitmore turned to look at her. How many? I don't know. I only know my own. But you've suspected this. I've suspected this since about month 3 of being Mara Voss. She kept her voice even. When you're told your record is clean, and then you notice things, small administrative anomalies, a reference that shouldn't have been visible in a background check, a clearance flag that had no basis, you start to understand that clean isn't the same as gone. Whitmore looked at Kaminsky, who had appeared in the doorway with his tablet. He hadn't said anything, but she could tell from his posture that he'd heard most of it. Run a cross-reference, Whitmore said to him. Harlan's personal files against the separation records from the past decade. Any sealed files with operational names that match civilian identities currently active. Kaminsky nodded and was already typing before he'd fully turned around. How long? Reyes asked. An hour, Kaminsky said from the doorway. Maybe less. Whitmore looked at Mara. The operation that led to your separation. The documentation you submitted. Do you remember the specifics? I remember everything I write, and everything I submit. Can you reconstruct it? I could reconstruct it tonight. Whitmore nodded. Something in her face had the quality of a decision being made that had been building for longer than this conversation. Then we're going to need you at a table with a recorder for the next 2 hours. Before that, Mara said, I need to know what happens to the file. Whitmore stopped. The Kira Solano file in Harlan's possession. I want to know what happens to it. It becomes evidence in a federal investigation. And after that investigation concludes, Whitmore looked at her steadily. That would be a matter for the director's office to determine. I want the connection formally severed, Mara said. Whatever documentation exists linking Kira Solano to Mara Voss, I want it destroyed through proper channels, with a federal certification that the separation is complete, the way it was supposed to be 6 years ago. That's a significant request. It's what I was promised 6 years ago and didn't receive, she said. I'm not asking for anything beyond what I was already owed. Whitmore held her gaze for a moment that was longer than most people would have held it. Then, I'll put it to the director. That's not the same as yes. No, Whitmore said. It's not. But it's the most honest thing I can tell you right now, and I think you'd rather have that. She was right. Mara nodded once. The next 2 hours were the most thorough conversation she'd had in 6 years. She sat at the table in the conference room with a recorder running and Whitmore opposite her and a DOJ attorney named Prescott who took notes with the focused speed of someone being paid specifically to get things down accurately, and she reconstructed the documentation she'd submitted 6 years ago from memory. Every figure, every timestamp, every chain of custody notation, every name in the oversight chain above her signature. She had always had a precise memory. It was the kind of thing that was useful in medicine and useful in operational work, and occasionally a liability in ordinary life, where remembering everything with that kind of clarity meant you also remembered the things you'd rather not. But right now it was exactly what the room needed, and she gave it everything without omission. When she was done, Prescott looked at what he'd written and then at her and said, "You've been carrying this for 6 years." "I've been noting it," she said. "That's different." He looked at her in a way that suggested he wasn't sure it was. When she came out of the conference room, Reyes was in the main operations area, sitting in a chair with a second cup of coffee and the careful stillness of someone conserving energy. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the exchange between them was brief and complete, the way their exchanges had been all day. "Kaminsky found 3 others," he said. She stopped. 3 other sealed files in Harlan's personal records. Operational names cross-referenced to active civilian identities. He held her gaze. All 3 of them were separated from the same program. All 3 in the past 8 years. Who are they? I don't know yet. The identities are still sealed pending the director's authorization to open them. He looked at his coffee. But they're out there, living as someone else, the same way you've been. She sat down across from him. The weight of that information had a physical quality, not crushing, but present. 3 other people who had submitted inconvenient documentation and been separated and told their records were clean, while someone kept a file with their real names in a locked drawer. He was building insurance, she said. He was building control, Reyes said. People who can be exposed at any time don't make inconvenient choices. They go back to being civilians and they stay quiet. He looked at her. Except you made an inconvenient choice this morning. I didn't know who he was this morning. No, you just saw a puncture mark. He set down the coffee. And you didn't stay quiet. She looked at the operations board. The screens were running the real-time feeds from the investigation, vehicle location data, communication intercepts, the administrative machinery of a federal case building itself in real time. It had the same quality as a hospital's overnight, relentless, unglamorous, the work that happened while the dramatic moments were over. The 3 others, she said. Someone should find them. Whitmore's office is going to. I want to know that someone talks to them, not serves them documentation, actually talks to them, explains what happened. She looked at him. 6 years of not understanding exactly why your record wasn't clean is its own kind of damage. Reyes looked at her for a moment. Is that what it was like? Partly. She was quiet for a second. Mostly it was like living in a space that was almost the right size, but not quite. Like something was slightly off in every room and you couldn't determine which wall was wrong. He was quiet too. I'm sorry, he said. The way he said it was plain and direct, without the decorative additions that people put on apologies to make them easier to deliver. Just the thing itself. It's not yours to apologize for, she said. No, but he seemed to decide against what he'd been going to say. Okay. Outside, through the walls, she could hear more vehicles arriving. The operation was consolidating. The DOJ team, additional federal agents, the administrative apparatus of an arrest that had implications up and down a chain of command. This was not, she understood, the kind of thing that ended quickly. What had started in Renner Valley General's Bay 4 at 7:43 in the morning was going to be producing paperwork and testimony and investigation reports for a long time. She found, sitting there, that she was all right with that. Garner was formally arrested at 4:17 in the afternoon in a ditch 3 miles from the abandoned vehicle, dehydrated and without communication equipment, which had apparently been the sum total of his extraction plan once the helicopter option failed. The federal agent who reported this to Rourke described it with the particular dry economy of someone who had expected more drama and been denied it. Harlan's arrest had been formalized 2 hours earlier. She'd learned this from Kaminsky, who relayed it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had spent the day building the case one metadata timestamp at a time and had every right to feel what he felt about the result. The committee room where it had happened was apparently quite large. The attendance was apparently quite substantial. The formal reading of the suspension and the federal charge instrument had happened in front of oversight officials whose entire purpose was to watch exactly this kind of thing occur and record it accurately. Accountability in public. The record reflecting what happened. She'd asked for that, and it had not been shaped into something smaller by the time it arrived. Rourke came to her at 5 o'clock. "The director's office called," he said, "regarding your request." She looked up. "Formal certification of separation for Kira Solano has been approved. The connection documents are being destroyed through the classified materials process. Witnessed, certified, and completed by close of business tomorrow." He paused. The director also authorized the same process for the 3 others in Harlan's files, contingent on their identification and consent. She let that settle. It settled differently than she'd expected. Not like a door closing, more like a window that had been painted shut for 6 years, finally being opened all the way, letting in air that she hadn't realized she'd been missing. "Thank you," she said. "Thank Whitmore," Rourke said. She made the argument. She would. It was Reyes who told her about Renner Valley, not Whitmore, because Whitmore was on the phone with Washington for most of the early evening, and Reyes had been the one on the line with Rourke when the update came through. He found her at the equipment table going through Falk's supply inventory. Restocking habit, the thing her hands did when they needed to be useful, and he sat down across from her and said, "The hospital." She stopped restocking. Hearst was called into a meeting with the chief of staff and the hospital board at 4 this afternoon. The DIA liaison provided a statement confirming your role in a federal medical operation. The statement doesn't detail the operation, but it confirms that your intervention was medically appropriate, federally significant, and that the patient survived because of it. He watched her face. "The chief of staff has requested a full review of your separation and Hearst's conduct this morning." "That's not reinstatement," she said. "No," he agreed. But the chief of staff also issued a preliminary directive suspending the termination pending review, which means as of right now you're not fired. She looked at the supply inventory in her hands. Hearst isn't going to like that. Hearst is apparently not having a great afternoon in general. Reyes's expression was carefully neutral. "He was pulled from the OR at 3 o'clock for the board meeting. I'm told he had opinions about that." "He always has opinions." "I'm also told the board had opinions about his opinions." She was quiet for a moment. "What did the board say? Specifically?" "I don't know. Generally, the chief of staff told the liaison that Dr. Hearst had, quote, significant questions to answer about the standard of care provided to a patient who was subsequently identified as a federal asset." He paused. "Nobody's using the words malpractice yet, but the review board will use the words they use." She thought about what she'd said to Whitmore. Not Hearst destroyed, the record reflecting what happened. She thought about the version of justice that was clean and satisfying and tidy and bore no resemblance to how things actually worked, and the version that was complicated and inconvenient and involved Hearst sitting in a board meeting, answering hard questions and coming out of it a different doctor than the one who'd walked in. One of those versions was real. She had asked for the real one. "Will he lose his license?" she asked. "I genuinely don't know," Reyes said. "That depends on what the review finds and how the board weighs it." She nodded. That was honest. She accepted it. "The patient in Bay 6, she said suddenly. "The 60-year-old with the chest pain. I was monitoring him when all of this started. He was—" "The hospital liaison confirmed he was discharged this afternoon," Reyes said. "Stable." She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "Okay." He looked at her for a moment. "You've been thinking about him all day." "I left in the middle of his vitals check." "You left because you were fired and escorted out by security." "I still left?" She put down the inventory. "That's the thing about the work. You don't get to choose when you walk away and have it not count." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you went back to nursing, after everything?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. Partly because the other work, the work I was good at, required me to be a version of myself that I wasn't sure I wanted to maintain. She looked at him. Nursing required me to care about the person in front of me. Just the person, not the strategic value, not the operational significance. The 60-year-old with chest pain, the man on the gurney with no documentation. Machi. She paused. That keeps you human in a way the other thing doesn't, if you're not careful. Reyes looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his face that was not the controlled neutrality of an operational professional, something more unguarded than she'd seen from him all day, which, given what they'd been through all day, was a considerable thing. You've been doing both today, he said. The human part and the other part. I know. Is that... He seemed to be choosing his words with care that was unusual for him. Is that something you'd want to keep doing? She understood what he was asking. It was a larger question than it appeared, and they both knew it, and she looked at him and gave it the honest consideration it deserved. Ask me after I've slept, she said, and eaten something that isn't from a package. His mouth moved, the compressed version of the real thing. Fair enough. Whitmore found her at 8 in the evening, standing outside the facility in the cooling air, watching the last of the federal vehicles run their lights down the county road. The investigation had achieved a kind of operational momentum that no longer required everyone present. The DOJ team had what they needed, the evidence chain was established, the formal processes were running themselves. The sky above the flatland was very large and very dark and full of stars, which she hadn't seen in a long time, living in a city. She stood in the gravel and looked at them with the particular attention of someone who hasn't had a quiet moment in 16 hours and is using this one fully. Whitmore stood beside her. They were quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable quiet, the quiet of two people who had been through something together and didn't need to narrate it. The director wants to meet you, Whitmore said eventually. I assumed someone would. Not to debrief, to meet. Whitmore looked at the sky. He was briefed on the full timeline, the hospital, the aircraft, the breach, your background. She paused. He wants to talk about what you want to do next. Mara looked at the stars. My options are what, exactly? At this moment? Broad. Whitmore said it without embellishment. The Kira Solano file is being destroyed. Your civilian record stays clean, but the federal record of today also exists, and it says things about you that the director finds relevant to certain positions he's been trying to fill. She looked at Mara. Medical intelligence specifically, you'd be surprised how rare your particular combination actually is. I wouldn't, Mara said. I've done the work. I know what it takes. That's exactly the problem we've had, Whitmore said. Finding people who know what it takes. Mara looked at the road where the last vehicle had disappeared. At the agricultural facility behind her with its temporary walls and its functional infrastructure and its total absence of anything that would make a person want to stay. At the sky above, which was indifferent and very beautiful. She thought about Renner Valley General, about Bay 4 and the supply restocks and the break room coffee and 3 years of being invisible. She thought about what invisible had cost her and what it had preserved and whether those were different things or the same thing looked at from different directions. She thought about the 60-year-old in Bay 6. She thought about the 3 other people whose files were in Harlan's locked drawer, living in apartments somewhere with slightly off-fitting rooms, not quite understanding why nothing seemed to be the right size. The 3 others, she said, when they're identified. I want to be part of the conversation. I can arrange that, Whitmore said, not as an asset, as someone who went through the same thing and came out the other side. She looked at Whitmore. That matters. The who you hear it from matters. I know it does. Whitmore turned to look at her fully. Is that a yes? Mara was quiet for a moment. The stars were very clear above the flat county land, and the night was cool in the way of evenings in early fall when the heat of summer is close enough to remember and far enough gone to appreciate the difference. It's a yes to the conversation, she said. The director's meeting, the discussion about what comes next. Yes to that. She paused. What I'm not agreeing to is going back to invisible. That's not what's being offered, Whitmore said. I know. I'm just being clear. You've been clear all day, Whitmore said. It was not a criticism. That's not the smallest part of why we're standing here. She went back to Renner Valley the next morning. Work drove her. He offered conversation for the first 15 minutes and then seemed to understand that she didn't want it, and they drove the rest of the way in silence that was comfortable in the specific way of two people who have made it through something together and don't need to reconstruct it verbally. The hospital looked exactly the same as it had 24 hours ago. Same parking lot lights still out. Same trash bag against the fence in the ambulance bay. The morning shift change was happening, and the parking lot was busy with the particular choreography of people arriving and departing in the tight window of handoff. She sat in the car for a moment. Rourke said, "You don't have to go in today." "I know," she said. "I want to." She went in. The ER received her the way it always received her, with the baseline chaos of a functioning trauma department at shift change, and with the specific awareness of a department that knew something had happened and didn't yet know exactly what. She felt eyes tracking her as she moved through the corridor. She noted them and kept moving. Trevor was at the nursing station. He looked up when he saw her, and something complicated went through his face, relief, probably, and uncertainty, and the specific guilt of someone who'd been thinking all night about whether they'd done the right thing. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. "Thank you for yesterday, for walking away." He looked at the counter. "I almost didn't." "I know. Thank you anyway." He nodded. She moved past the station toward the charge desk where Dennis Reyes was running the handoff board. He stopped when he saw her. "Voss?" "Dennis." He looked at her for a moment. "Chief of Staff called this morning. Said you were on preliminary reinstatement." "That's what I understand." "Also said there's a review board scheduled for end of next week." He held her gaze. "For Hearst?" She nodded. Dennis looked at his board. He was a practical person, and he dealt in practical information. "Bay 3 needs someone with a head for cardiac monitoring. The overnight missed a QT interval issue, and the attending wants someone to stay on it." "I'll take it," she said. "Good." He handed her the chart. "Welcome back, I guess." She took the chart and went to Bay 3. The patient was 71, retired school teacher, admitted overnight with palpitations. She read the overnight notes, looked at the monitoring strip, found the QT issue that had been missed, and sat down next to the bed to review the medication list. The woman was awake, watching her with the wary, alert attention of a person who had been in a hospital long enough to know that the quality of their care depended heavily on who was paying attention. "Good morning," Mara said. "I'm Mara. I'm going to be watching your heart monitor for a while." The woman looked at her. "Have you been here long? I haven't seen you before." "I've been here 3 years," Mara said. "You just haven't been in." "Well," the woman said. "That's good, I suppose. Being healthy." "That's the goal," Mara agreed. She settled the chart and began the assessment, working through it with the complete attention that the work deserved, and that she gave it every time, regardless of what else was happening, regardless of what else had happened. This was the floor of everything. The specific named person in front of her, the numbers that mattered, the thing that would happen if she was wrong or slow or insufficiently careful. Everything else was built on top of this. She was still there 2 hours later when Whitmore called. She stepped into the hallway and answered. "The director has time at 1400, Whitmore said. "It'll be a video call. Secure line. We'll send you the details." "I'm at the hospital until noon." "I know. 1400 works?" "It works. One other thing." Whitmore paused. "Reyes asked me to pass something along. He said, and I'm quoting directly because the phrasing matters, he said, 'Tell her the answer to her question is yes.'" Mara stopped. She thought about what question that could be. She'd asked him several things on the helicopter and in the operations room, but there was one that had been less operational than the others, one where she'd asked something about what she was doing and whether it was something she'd want to keep doing, and he'd said, "Ask me after I've slept." "Tell him the answer to his question is yes, too," she said. A brief pause. "I'll let him know." Whitmore's voice had the quality of someone choosing not to have any reaction to this information. 1400, we'll send the link." She hung up and stood in the hallway for a moment. The ER moved around her, gurneys, voices, equipment, the continuous demanding rhythm of a place where people came with their worst hours and expected the best of someone else. She had spent 6 years learning to be invisible. She'd been very good at it. She'd moved through rooms without leaving evidence that she'd been there. She'd suppressed the parts of herself that took up space. She'd made herself small enough to fit into a role that was designed for someone with a different history. And she had been, despite all of that, excellent at the work. She had been excellent because the work itself demanded the parts of her she'd tried to put away. The precision, the instinct, the capacity to see what everyone else had looked past. You couldn't separate the person from the practice. She'd spent 3 years trying to, and had ended up with a 60-year-old's cardiac chart in one hand, and a federal operation in the other, and a personnel file with a different name inside an arrested man's office safe. The parts of her she'd tried to bury were the parts that kept other people alive. She thought about accountability, about the record reflecting what happened, about what it meant to ask for the real version of justice instead of the clean version, the complicated, inconvenient, institutional version that required review boards and federal certification and conversations with directors and secure video calls. It was slower than the clean version. It was less satisfying in the moment. It was the kind of justice that looked from the outside like nothing much happening, until you understood that what was happening was change that would last. Hearst would go to his review board. He would answer questions about a morning that had challenged everything he believed about his own certainty. He would come out of it differently than he'd gone in, either humbled by what the record showed or defensive against it, and the board would determine which. That was how it was supposed to work. It was imperfect, and it was slow, and it was real. Harlan was in federal custody with a case built from metadata timestamps and an operational memory and the testimony of people he'd tried to silence. He had believed, for 8 years, that the files in his locked drawer were power. He'd learned yesterday that they were evidence. Garner was in federal custody in a ditch, which was less philosophically interesting but equally concrete. And the 3 others, whoever they were, wherever they'd built their 2 small rooms, were going to get a phone call that explained what had happened to them and confirmed that the connection had been severed the way it was supposed to have been severed years ago. She didn't know if that would fix anything. She didn't know if knowing the reason for your displacement made it easier to live in. Probably it depended on the person. She would be part of those conversations. She'd asked for that, and it had been agreed to, and she intended to make it mean something. She went back to Bay 3. The woman with the QT issue was awake and had opinions about the hospital breakfast, which she was sharing with the day aide in the specific energetic way of a person who was feeling better than she'd felt the night before. Mara reviewed the monitoring strip, noted the improvement, made her notations in the chart. "Better this morning?" she asked. "Much," the woman said. She looked at Mara with the sharp attention of a retired teacher who had spent decades reading people. "You look like you've had a long couple of days." "One day," Mara said. "It was a long one. Those are sometimes the ones that matter most." Mara looked at the monitoring strip, then at the woman. "Sometimes," she said. At 1:45, she handed the Bay 3 chart to Trevor with specific instructions about the medication timing and the next monitoring window, and she went to the break room and opened her laptop and joined the secure video call with 2 minutes to spare. The director was a man in his 60s with the kind of face that had done a great deal of difficult work and had made peace with it. He looked at her through the screen with the direct attention of someone who had read the briefing and was now doing his own assessment, which was different from the briefing in the ways that always mattered. "Ms. Voss," he said, then, "or would you prefer—" "Mara is fine," she said. "The other name is being retired. Officially, as of this morning," he said. "The certification is complete." She nodded. "I've read everything," he said. "Yesterday's operation, the historical documentation you provided, the file we found, the separation record." He looked at her. "I want to start by saying that what was done to you and the others was wrong. Not a policy failure, not a procedural error. Wrong." He said it plainly. "And I want that on the record of this conversation." She hadn't expected that to land the way it did. She'd been prepared for the operational discussion, for the forward-looking conversation about what she would or wouldn't be asked to do. She hadn't been prepared for someone to say the plain thing first. "Thank you," she said. "Deputy Director Harlan will be arraigned tomorrow. The charge instrument includes abuse of authority, obstruction of federal process, and conspiracy to commit assault against a federal asset. The prosecutor's office has indicated they expect a plea within 60 days given the evidence package." He paused. "The 3 individuals whose files were in his possession have been contacted. All 3 are aware of the situation. One of them, a man named Ortega, currently living in Phoenix, asked specifically if you would be part of the follow-up conversation. Samiti, I will be, she said. I told him that was likely. The director looked at her. Whitmore has briefed me on the potential role she discussed with you. I want to be transparent about what that role would require and what it would not require. It is not a return to embedded operations. It is advisory and medical intelligence structured around your existing civilian practice. You would retain your nursing license and your position at Renner Valley. In fact, we'd prefer it. The civilian practice is the cover that makes the advisory role functional. How often? When we need you, which may be frequently or may not be. That's honest. He paused. The Keene Street operation is not a template for what this looks like normally. Yesterday was extreme by any measure. I know what extreme looks like, she said. Yes, he said. That's exactly why we're having this conversation. She looked at the screen, at the director of an intelligence agency who had said that what had been done to her was wrong, and had said it first, and had said it plainly. I have one condition, she said. Tell me. Whatever I do in that advisory capacity, whatever I contribute, whatever decisions I'm part of, it's documented under my name. Not an operational alias, not a ghost ID, my name. She looked at him directly. I spent 6 years being invisible. I'm done with that. The director looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. Slowly and with the weight of someone who understood exactly what she was asking and why. Done, he said. But she finished her shift at 6. She changed out of her scrubs in the locker room. The same locker room where security had walked her to collect her things 24 hours ago, and she pulled on her jacket and picked up her bag and walked out through the main corridor the way she always did. Past the charge station where Dennis was doing his end-of-shift board. Past Bay 6, empty now, turned over for the next patient. Past the supply closet that she had already restocked before anyone knew it needed it. Past Bay 4, where the curtain was drawn and a new patient was in the bed and the monitors were running and the staff were doing exactly what staff did, which was pay attention to the person in front of them and try to get it right. She stopped for just a moment outside the curtain. She wasn't sentimental about rooms. She wasn't the kind of person who assigned meaning to locations. But she stood there for a second anyway because some things deserved a second, and then she moved on. The parking lot was the same as always. The lights were still out. The trash bag against the fence was gone, finally. Someone had picked it up sometime during the day, and the small absence of it changed the whole fence line in a way that was disproportionate to how small the thing had been. She walked to her car. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't have saved yet, but recognized from the helicopter. How's the patient in Bay 3? She stopped. She thought about the fact that Reyes had asked Whitmore to relay a message about a question that was not an operational question. She thought about the director's call and the answer she'd given Whitmore to pass along. She thought about what it meant that the first thing he'd texted her was not about the operation or the case or what came next, but about the 71-year-old retired schoolteacher with the QT interval issue. She typed, better. They caught the medication timing on the afternoon round. She's probably going home tomorrow. 3 dots. Then, good. Then, after a moment, are you going home tonight? She looked at the text. She looked at the fence where the trash bag had been and wasn't anymore. She looked at the parking lot lights that were still out and had been out since February and that someone would eventually fix when someone eventually filed the work order, which might be sooner than it had been yesterday. She typed, eventually. I have a call to make first. She was thinking of Ortega in Phoenix, who had asked if she would be part of the conversation. She would call Whitmore tonight and ask for his number, and she would call him before she slept, because he'd been living in an off-fitting room for however many years, and he'd asked specifically if she'd be there, and that question deserved an answer before morning. She got in her car. She sat for a moment with the engine off, in the quiet of an ordinary evening that was not, in any way, the same evening as the one that had existed before this morning. Some days changed the shape of what came after. Most days didn't. This one had, completely and without qualification, and she sat with that for a second the way she sat with most things, fully, without looking away, letting it be exactly as large as it was. She had walked into a hospital bay at 7:43 in the morning and seen a puncture mark that nobody else had bothered to look for. She had been dismissed and told she was unqualified. She had been escorted from the building. She had been told her assessment was wrong by a man who had never once questioned whether he might be the one who was wrong. And she had been right and had held to that, and had gone back inside when she could have kept walking, and she had sat on the floor of a helicopter and read a medication case and understood what was in it. And she had dropped toward the threat instead of away from it. And she had sat at a table and reconstructed 6 years of documentation from memory, and she had asked for accountability instead of destruction, and she had asked for her name to be on the work she did. And all of those things were choices, and none of them had been easy, and all of them had mattered. She thought about what she'd told Reyes on the helicopter when he'd asked why she'd gone back to nursing. The human part, the thing that kept you human if you were careful. She thought you probably had to keep choosing it over and over, in the small moments and the large ones equally. The 60-year-old's vitals, the name on the record, the phone call to a man in Phoenix who needed to hear a human voice explain what had been done to him and why it was over now. You kept choosing the human part, and it kept you the person you were trying to be. And that was not a clean or satisfying or uncomplicated process. It was just the work. The continuous, demanding, necessary work. She started the car. She had a call to make.